Right now, as you hear these very words, something extraordinary is unfolding above London. This began precisely 102 minutes ago. At this exact instant, a shimmering aberration, a distortion akin to heat haze rising from pavement on a scorching summer day, is suspended in the atmosphere, perfectly encircling a 2-kilometer diameter zone centered on the London Eye. However, this is no natural atmospheric event. The air is frigid, imbued with the damp, penetrating chill of the Thames. For those caught within the initial moments on the ground, it didn't manifest as a visual spectacle, but as a profound internal sensation, a disorienting sense of imbalance, a dizzying vertigo that felt as if it were pulling them in every conceivable direction simultaneously. Then, an unnerving quiet descended, as though the very air had become viscous, muffling the city's cacophony into a faint, distant rumble. There was no sound, no detonation, no forewarning. What occurred was a silent, insidious invasion of the fabric of reality within this specific radius. The fundamental laws of physics, the very principles that govern our existence, were being systematically dismantled. Vehicles, those iconic double-decker buses, and the ubiquitous black cabs, are not combusting. They are simply ascending, drifting upwards from the streets with the serene, dreamlike gradualness of a child's released balloon. They are not propelled. They are not flying under their own power. Their inherent mass, the very quality that anchors them to the planet, is being nullified. On the south bank, the river has begun to reverse its course. Its waters are now climbing the concrete embankments in a placid, silent surge that defies the very notion of gravity. Nothing is behaving as it should. Within this shimmering expanse, the world has become unmoored from the universe we understand. This is not an assault of raw energy or physical matter. It appears to be a direct assault on the foundational rules themselves. Before we proceed, remember to engage the like button, subscribe to our channel, and activate the notification bell, but only if you genuinely find calm science to be a soothing companion for relaxation or sleep. Please let us know in the comments section your current location and the time of day as you are listening. Let us commence this exploration of a fictional worst-case scenario. Chapter 1. The initial response from governmental bodies was one of utter disarray, operating under the flawed assumption that the world remained as it was. The London Fire Brigade, responding to a deluge of automated alerts, found their engines sputtering to a halt a dozen meters shy of the shimmering boundary, their electronic systems completely unresponsive. Emergency personnel attempting to proceed on foot described an inexplicable, invisible pressure resisting their advance, a sensation they later likened to pushing against an unyielding wall of solid water. The first unmanned aerial vehicle dispatched by the Metropolitan Police's counter-terrorism unit performed flawlessly until it crossed the threshold of the affected area. Its video feed did not abruptly terminate. For 3 agonizing seconds, it transmitted images of a world consumed by madness, the sky depicted as a deep, unsettling purple. Within the drone's own camera housing, reality itself appeared to contort and liquefy before the signal abruptly ceased. Within mere minutes, every scientific instrument trained on the zone began relaying data that was, to put it mildly, nonsensical. Gravimeters, instruments calibrated to measure the local gravitational field with extraordinary precision, did not merely indicate a reduction in gravitational pull. They flatlined. According to the recorded readings, gravity within the affected zone had ceased to exist entirely. Yet, objects were not scattering into the void of space. Instead, they were suspended in a state of neutral buoyancy, as if submerged in an unseen, impossibly dense medium. Far from the epicenter, the LIGO and Virgo gravitational wave observatories, instruments designed to detect the colossal collisions of black holes billions of light-years distant, registered an unprecedented phenomenon, a gravitational shadow. It was as if the city of London had been surgically excised from the planet's gravitational influence, leaving behind a void that distorted the readings of the most sophisticated instruments ever conceived by humankind. At CERN, hundreds of miles away in Switzerland, alarms that had remained silent throughout the facility's entire history began to blare. The compact muon solenoid sensors, buried deep beneath the Earth's surface, detected a shockwave propagating not through solid ground, but through the very fabric of spacetime. This wave originated from London. It was a ripple in the quantum field itself, a definitive announcement that the universe's fundamental code had just been rewritten. One senior physicist, Dr. Eris Thorne, later characterized the collected data in a leaked internal memorandum as, quote, not a measurement of an event, but a measurement of a fundamental alteration in the constants of nature. It was as if the divine hand had reached down and adjusted one of its universal dials. The dial he was referring to is the Higgs field. In simplified terms, the Higgs field permeates the entirety of the universe. As subatomic particles traverse this field, they acquire mass. This is the underlying reason for weight, the force that holds celestial bodies together, and the very principle binding you to your current location. The data emerging from CERN suggested that within the designated London zone, the Higgs field had been somehow diminished or entirely negated. This constitutes a scientific impossibility, an endeavor requiring more energy than is contained within our entire solar system. To nullify the Higgs field would be akin to attempting to empty the ocean with a mere teaspoon. Yet, the evidence was irrefutable. The vehicles were floating, and the Thames was flowing uphill, all because, within a localized region, the universe had seemingly forgotten how to impart mass. This violation of gravitational principles was merely the prelude. The truly alarming phase commenced 51 minutes ago, when the physical constants governing electromagnetism began to falter. The fine structure constant, a dimensionless quantity approximating 1/137 that dictates the intensity of interaction between light and matter, started to fluctuate within the affected zone. To observers on the ground, the initial effects were subtle, escalating rapidly to catastrophic proportions. The very essence of color began to degrade. The iconic crimson hue of the city's buses shifted, morphing into a deeper, unsettling violet before dissolving into an indefinable shade that the human eye was not evolved to perceive. Streetlights did not simply extinguish. The light they emitted was compressed into increasingly higher frequencies, transitioning from yellow to blue, then to ultraviolet, and finally beyond the visible spectrum entirely, leaving behind an eerie, invisible deluge of potent radiation. All electronic devices within the zone failed instantaneously. This was not an electromagnetic pulse, or EMP, capable of frying circuits. This represented a far more fundamental form of assault. Individuals holding their smartphones watched as the liquid crystal displays liquefied into a milky, inert fluid, the glass screens becoming warm and yielding in their grasp. As the fine structure constant wavered, the molecular bonds holding together complex microchips began to dissolve. Silicon wafers and copper pathways lost their structural integrity, not from melting due to heat, but by simply disintegrating. Their constituent atoms were no longer bound by the rules that had enabled their functionality. A report from the United Kingdom's Ministry of Defense, classified under the codename Event Chimera, describes this phenomenon with stark clarity. Quote, "The designated area is experiencing a progressive breakdown of physical laws. Phase 1 targeted the Higgs mechanism. Phase 2 is targeting the electromagnetic force. We are not observing a conventional attack. We are witnessing a localized and controlled failure of reality." The report further elaborates that deploying human observers or remote drones is impossible. Anything that breaches the shimmering boundary is immediately subjected to the new, alien physics within, its matter ceasing to adhere to the laws of our universe. The zone of altered physics is no longer expanding. It appears to have reached a stable, albeit horrifying, new equilibrium. It has become a malignant growth upon the very fabric of our existence. And at its very core, the final act of this impossible event is now unfolding. The Shard, London's tallest skyscraper, a monument of glass and steel that pierces the sky, has begun to delocalize. It is not succumbing to heat or succumbing to force. From its apex downwards, the crystalline integrity of its glass panels and the metallic lattice of its steel frame are losing coherence. The electromagnetic forces that bind atom to atom are being reconfigured into an unknowable, alien configuration. The tower is dissolving into a floating, shimmering cloud of disconnected particles. However, this cloud is not chaotic. It is slowly, deliberately coalescing. The trillions of particles are arranging themselves not into mere dust, but into a vast, intricate, and gradually rotating fractal pattern. This is not an end. It is a metamorphosis. It is the genesis of a new, utterly alien Earth. The structure that was once the Shard is more than just a silent, glittering memorial. The immense, rotating fractal composed of disconnected particles is now performing an action. It is broadcasting. There is no discernible radio signal, no electromagnetic radiation, no audible sound. The broadcast is of a nature for which we possess no name and no defense. It is a structured, rhythmic pulse within the quantum foam itself. A signal that does not traverse space, but instead induces space itself to resonate. And its target is not our technology. Its target is the 3 pounds of electric meat housed within every human skull. The conflict for London was a war against physics. This new, silent war is for the very essence of reality. This second phase commenced not as a singular event, but as a creeping, global psychosis. In Munich, America, a city planner, while stuck in traffic, suddenly witnessed the Alps on the horizon dissolve into a churning sea of purple tendrils. In a rice paddy in rural Japan, a farmer looked up to see a second, black sun burning in the sky. In a quiet suburban dwelling in Ohio, a mother gazed at her child and, for a fleeting, terrifying instant, saw not a familiar face, but a shifting lattice of crystalline light. These were not isolated instances of madness. They were the nascent stages of a shared, planetary hallucination. Millions of individuals, separated by vast distances, began experiencing identical impossible visions, reporting consistent details with unnerving accuracy. Neuroscientists at the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig were the first to grasp the underlying mechanism. Dr. Aller Vance, utilizing next-generation magnetoencephalography, or MEG scanners, discovered that the brains of affected individuals exhibited a highly unusual, coherent pattern of neural activity. It was neither the chaotic surge of a seizure nor the random noise of a psychotic episode. Instead, it was a structured, complex, and profoundly rhythmic signal that was utterly alien to the architecture of the human brain. Her terrifying conclusion was that the signal emanating from London was functioning as a broadcast antenna, leveraging the principles of quantum entanglement to directly interface with the microtubules within every human neuron. It bypassed the senses entirely. This was not a psychological assault. It was a neurological one. It constituted a form of data injection, a direct feed of alien sensory information being channeled into human consciousness, overriding the reality that our own brains were attempting to construct. Our fundamental perception of the world was being systematically compromised. While humanity's collective mind was under siege, its global technological infrastructure began a silent, systematic collapse. The initial indicators were subtle, manifesting only within the most sensitive scientific and financial sectors. Quantum computers, hailed as humanity's ultimate computational hope, started failing worldwide. Their delicate qubits, reliant on a state of perfect quantum stability, were experiencing catastrophic decoherence rates. It was as if a universal static was screaming at the subatomic level, rendering quantum calculations impossible. Subsequently, the global positioning system began to drift, not by meters, but by kilometers. While the atomic clocks on the satellites remained perfectly synchronized, the space-time they were measuring was being subtly warped by the London broadcast, rendering their precise calculations meaningless. The effect cascaded. High-frequency trading algorithms, dependent on microsecond timing, caused the world's stock markets to crash. Long-range radio astronomy arrays, such as the Square-Kilometre Array in South Africa, were rendered inoperable, their sensors overwhelmed by a coherent quantum noise that drowned out the faint light from distant galaxies. This was the true brilliance of the attack. It was not a blunt force assault utilizing conventional weaponry. It was a surgical strike targeting the twin pillars of our civilization, our shared, stable reality and the advanced technology that relies upon it. The entities designated as 3 Atlas understood that to subjugate a species like humanity, one need not obliterate their cities. It is sufficient to sow doubt about the nature of reality itself, while simultaneously blinding their most sophisticated instruments. This led to a frantic, behind-the-scenes debate that fractured the world's intelligence and scientific communities. The first and most evident interpretation, advocated strongly by the military, was that this was a weapon. The Pentagon's official stance, outlined in a document codenamed Cognitive Hazard, posited that humanity was the target of a planetary-scale psychological warfare operation, a psionic weapon designed to induce mass psychosis and technological paralysis, thereby paving the way for a conventional physical invasion. It was an elegant and deeply unsettling theory, and it might have held true were it not for the anomalies. Dr. Vance and her team at the Max Planck Institute uncovered a detail that did not align with the weapon hypothesis. The shared hallucinations were not merely random projections of terror. Embedded deep within the chaotic and nightmarish landscapes was a discernible pattern, a highly complex, repeating mathematical sequence based on the distribution of prime numbers within a multidimensional array. It was a signal of staggering complexity, far too organized to be the product of a simple terror weapon. This gave rise to a second, far more disturbing theory, one that was whispered in the hushed corridors of research institutions, deemed too outlandish for public disclosure. What if this is not an attack? What if it is an attempt at communication? This theory suggests that the entity or intelligence behind 3 Atlas is not a three-dimensional being like ourselves. It may be a creature from higher dimensions or a being of pure information. Its thoughts, its very consciousness, are so vast and intricate that their mere existence is corrosive to our limited three-dimensional reality. The physical disintegration of London was not an act of malevolence. It was simply the residual effect of this being's attention briefly touching our world. The neurological assault is not a weapon intended to drive us mad. It is the unfiltered, raw data stream of its consciousness, which our rudimentary brains can only interpret as nightmarish visions. We are not under attack. We are simply being perceived by something that inherently disrupts whatever it observes. The prime number sequence represents the only element of its thought process simple enough for our mathematical frameworks to comprehend. It is the alien equivalent of a baby's first uttered words. And the very act of articulating them is unraveling our universe. This leads to the ultimate, terrifying question that no one can yet answer. What if its intention is not to shatter our minds, but to reveal its own? Chapter 2. While the world's foremost neuroscientists and physicists engaged in a desperate debate concerning the true nature of the London anomaly, whether it constituted an assault on consciousness or a catastrophic attempt at communication, the authentic, undeniable phase of the invasion had already commenced. The argument, in retrospect, became tragically academic, for 3 Atlas did not await our comprehension of its initial move before executing its second. This subsequent attack was not subtle, quantum, or enigmatic. It was brutally physical, horrifyingly biological, and it targeted every single human being on the planet simultaneously. It began not with a detonation, but with a fine, reddish-brown dust released in a silent, expanding cloud from the now orbiting alien fleet. This particulate matter was dispersed into the uppermost reaches of the stratosphere, engineered to be carried globally by the jet streams over a period of weeks. The initial release was almost imperceptible, detected only by atmospheric monitoring stations that mistook it for a plume of Saharan dust or high-altitude ash from a distant volcanic eruption. It was a flawless, silent delivery system. By the time any organization, from NASA to the European Weather Center, realized the particulate was of a uniform, unnatural composition and had achieved near-total global coverage, it was already far too late. The dust had already settled from the upper atmosphere, blanketing continents, cities, and oceans in a microscopic, almost imperceptible layer. It was present on our vehicles, in our water reservoirs, and most critically, within the very air we inhaled. Within a month, every individual on Earth was infected. The world's leading biological and chemical defense laboratories, from Fort Detrick in Maryland to Portondown in the UK, scrambled to analyze this substance. What they discovered baffled and terrified them. Under an electron microscope, the individual grains of dust were revealed to be astonishingly complex. Each was a perfectly formed, silicon-based macromolecule, an intricate cage of crystalline lattice work entirely alien to carbon-based biology. Suspended within this cage, immersed in an inert gel, was what appeared to be a virus-like structure. It possessed the protein keys necessary to interface with the human cell's ACE2 receptor, the same gateway utilized by coronaviruses. However, its core was not RNA or DNA. Instead, it was a crystalline shard composed of what appeared to be a complex inorganic polymer. For weeks, this alien agent remained entirely dormant. It was non-reactive. It did nothing. It was, for all practical purposes, sophisticated dust. The CDC and the WHO issued reassuring preliminary reports, noting that while the substance was of extraterrestrial origin, it appeared biologically inert. This proved to be the deadliest miscalculation in human history. The activation occurred on a Tuesday at precisely 1300 hours Greenwich Mean Time. It was not initiated by a chemical or biological trigger. It was a signal. The 3 Atlas fleet, maintaining a high, stable orbit, broadcast a single, ultra-low frequency radio wave that enveloped the entire planet. The frequency was so low that it passed through water, earth, and flesh as if they were non-existent. But it was not intended for our auditory perception. It was the activation key for the dormant agent lying in wait within billions of human bodies. The initial symptom was universal and deceptively benign, a distinct metallic taste in the mouth, accompanied by a faint tingling numbness in the extremities. Within hours, the second stage began. Faint reddish lines started appearing on the skin of the infected, which is to say, everyone. These were not random rashes. They were perfectly geometric patterns forming intricate hexagonal and triangular lattices that spread from the chest outwards. It was the first visual indication that something was being constructed internally. The alien virus was not a virus at all. It was a programmable, molecular-scale factory. The crystalline shard at its core contained a set of instructions, and the radio broadcast from orbit served as the execute command. Once activated, The agent initiated a process of terrifying biological alchemy. It hijacked the host's cellular mitochondria, not merely for energy, but as miniature furnaces. These furnaces began to extract trace elements from the bloodstream: iron, magnesium, copper, and especially silicon, which is present in the human body in small but sufficient quantities. Utilizing the host's own life energy, it began to fabricate microscopic crystalline structures, assembling them with nanoscale precision within tissues, organs, and blood vessels. This was the Crimson Plague. It was not a disease that was breaking down the body. It was a construction process that was rebuilding the body into something entirely new. The third and final phase was the transformation, a period of body horror so profound and systematic that it defied all known biological paradigms. It typically commenced within 72 hours of activation. The geometric patterns on the skin, which were the surface manifestations of the crystalline structures forming beneath, began to thicken and solidify. The supple, yielding human tissue was undergoing a slow, deliberate transformation. In its place, a rigid, crimson chitinous exoskeleton, a fusion of organic and mineral elements, was forming. The efficiency of this process was absolute. The scientific horror of it was captured in an audio log from Dr. Kenji Tanaka, a biologist at the Japanese National Institute of Infectious Diseases, who chronicled his own metamorphosis. In his final, raspy recording, he articulated, "This pathogen, it's not replicating, it's constructing. My circulatory system is being commandeered. Blood analysis reveals my hemoglobin is being systematically supplanted by a silicon-copper compound. While more effective for oxygen transport, it is decidedly not human. The body is being optimized. Crystalline lattices have integrated with my skeletal structure, fortifying it from within. My bone is becoming a composite material, akin to ceramic reinforcement bars. The most unsettling aspect is the absence of pain. The agent induces a potent neuroinhibitor, rendering the host docile, a mere passenger in their own bodily evolution. The brain is deliberately preserved, maintained online and fully aware until the very conclusion. This is not a weapon intended for our demise. It is a tool to fundamentally alter us. Across the globe, humanity was undergoing conversion. The change was total. The host's biomass served as raw material, their consciousness a temporary anomaly within the system. Upon completion of the transformation, the host's higher cognitive functions would permanently cease. The flicker of consciousness would extinguish as the last remnants of their biological brain were transmuted into a crystalline processing unit. The transformed beings were no longer human. They became silent, armored, reddish-brown entities, moving with an unsettling, measured gait. They did not confront the unaltered. Instead, they simply disregarded them, their newly formed eyes emitting a faint internal luminescence. The true objective, the final, chilling revelation of the Crimson Plague, became apparent only in the concluding hours of the global metamorphosis. The repurposed humans were not mindless automatons destined for extinction. They began to move with a unified, collective intent, drawn by an imperceptible signal. They converged in open areas, parks, city plazas, fields. There, they would halt, stand, and initiate the final phase. Their hardened limbs would interlock. Their chitinous bodies would exude a metallic bonding agent. They connected to one another, hundreds, then thousands at a time. Their individual forms became the constituent elements of something vast and animate. The Crimson Plague was not designed for the extermination of the human race. It was engineered to transform the human race into the living biological infrastructure for the subsequent phase of alien colonization. We were not the enemy to be vanquished. We were the material to be reshaped. The logic underpinning the Crimson Plague mirrored that of a factory, not a battlefield. It was a process of resource repurposing, converting 7 billion individuals into the literal biological foundation for an alien world. The sheer horror of this undertaking, the sight of loved ones systematically dismantled and reassembled into components of a living alien lattice, overshadowed the paramount strategic question. Why? A species capable of rewriting physics over London and engineering a programmable molecular pathogen could have undoubtedly eradicated humanity through far simpler, more direct means. Kinetic bombardment, atmospheric incineration, a straightforward lethal virus, all would have been less complex. The terrifying, intricate nature of the Crimson Plague implied a motive far more peculiar than mere subjugation. It was a bespoke key designed for a specific lock, and the most dreadful discovery was that for a minuscule, statistically anomalous fraction of the human population, the key failed to turn. These were the survivors. They were not concentrated in any particular geographical zone. Their distribution was random, a handful in a remote village, a few dozen in a sprawling metropolis, a solitary oil rig worker in the middle of the ocean. They had inhaled the same crimson dust. They had been bathed in the same global activation frequency. Yet, their bodies remained unchanged. They were immune. And within their immunity lay the profoundly clarifying answer to the question of purpose. As they navigated a silent world populated by their transformed, interlinked brethren, they became the focus of humanity's final scientific endeavors. In a few fortified, self-contained research outposts, most notably the World Health Organization's BSL-4 laboratory in Geneva, scientists who had managed to isolate themselves before the plague's activation worked with a singular, desperate objective: to comprehend the nature of this immunity. The initial hypotheses were predictable. Perhaps it was a pre-existing condition, an environmental factor, or a unique immune system quirk. All proved incorrect. Blood samples from the immune individuals, analyzed under the most powerful microscopes, revealed the alien agent was present within their cells. It had successfully penetrated the cytoplasm, just as it had in all others. However, at that point, the process simply halted. The agent remained inert, its crystalline core dark and inactive, its molecular machinery failing to interact with the host's mitochondria. It wasn't that the body was resisting it. Rather, the agent itself refused to activate. It was a lock that declined to open. Dr. Anna Sharma, the lead geneticist at the Geneva facility, achieved the breakthrough. After sequencing the complete genomes of over 1,000 diverse survivors from across the globe, her team identified a single unifying element. Every immune individual, without exception, shared a specific, exceptionally rare, and identical segment of DNA located on their 8th chromosome. It was a lengthy non-coding sequence that had, until then, been dismissed as superfluous genetic material, a remnant of our evolutionary past with no discernible biological function. But it was no relic. It was a trigger, and its presence in these few individuals had shielded them from the plague. In her private research log, Dr. Sharma wrote, "The sequence is unlike anything I have ever encountered. It is not merely its length, but its structure. It possesses a mathematical complexity, a quasi-crystalline pattern within its nucleotide repetitions that is not a product of natural selection. It appears designed. Our prevailing hypothesis is no longer that these individuals possess a gene that confers protection. Our hypothesis is that the rest of humanity possessed a gene that rendered them susceptible. The Crimson Plague was not an assault on our species. It was an assault on a specific genetic lineage, a lineage that, it turns out, comprises 99.9% of the population. We are the anomaly. The survivors are the exception to a rule we were unaware existed." This discovery fundamentally reshaped the entire narrative of the invasion. This was not a random act of aggression. It was a deliberate culling, a systematic purge. And it linked the 3 Atlas event to one of the most profound and terrifying concepts in cosmology: the Great Filter. The Great Filter is a proposed explanation for the Fermi paradox, the question of why, in a universe so vast, we have never encountered other intelligent life. The theory posits that there exists some insurmountable barrier, some predictable and nearly impossible challenge that prevents civilizations from achieving galactic scale. Perhaps they self-destruct through nuclear warfare. Perhaps they deplete their planet's resources. Or, as a new, horrifying theory began to take hold in the Geneva bunker, perhaps the Great Filter is not a natural impediment at all. Perhaps it is an action, a recurring, galactic-scale harvest conducted by a predatory civilization to eliminate any potential competition before it can pose a threat. The Crimson Plague was the instrument of that harvest, a biological key precisely calibrated to the dominant genetic signature of life on this planet. The aliens of 3 Atlas were not, in the conventional sense, colonists. They were exterminators. They were the agents of the Great Filter, and their arrival signified that humanity had reached its predetermined conclusion. This, then, was the gamble, that a species could be so genetically uniform that a single, targeted plague could effectively eradicate it, leaving behind a planet's worth of repurposed biomass and a handful of harmless, genetically divergent survivors who could be dealt with later. But this led to an even deeper enigma. Where did the protective gene sequence originate? If it was not a product of natural human evolution, its existence implied a second, even more ancient extraterrestrial intervention. The theory that emerged was as fantastical as it was terrifying, that the junk DNA was not ours at all. It was a marker, a genetic brand imprinted on a small population of early hominids hundreds of thousands of years ago by an unknown precursor race, an ancient interstellar civilization that, for reasons of its own, had tagged a fraction of Earth's nascent intelligent life. Was this an act of preservation? Were our distant ancestors part of an immense cosmic experiment, with the immune survivors serving as the control group? Or was it something else entirely? The final desperate act of the Geneva team was to test this theory. They could not devise a cure for the plague, but they could investigate the function of this mysterious genetic sequence. Employing advanced CRISPR-based gene editing tools, they isolated the sequence from a survivor's DNA and activated it within a controlled in vitro culture of human cells. They were searching for any indication of protein expression, any biological function they could identify. What they obtained was something else entirely. The moment the sequence was fully activated, the petri dish of human cells emitted a single, powerful, and highly complex radio signal. It was a tight beam burst, lasting only 72 seconds, containing a staggering amount of encoded data. It was a message. As the terrified technicians triangulated the signal's characteristics, they ran its core frequency and modulation against every astronomical database on Earth. They found a match, a perfect, undeniable match to a signal that had perplexed radio astronomers for nearly 50 years. The frequency, the signal strength, the Doppler shift, it was identical to the unexplained WOW signal, a powerful anomalous radio transmission detected by the Big Ear radio telescope in 1977, which was believed to have originated from the direction of the constellation Sagittarius. The revelation was absolute. The WOW signal was not a message sent to Earth from a distant star. It was a message sent from Earth. It was a homing beacon, a tripwire embedded within the human genome for millennia, designed to activate and broadcast a signal if its host cells were ever targeted by a specific type of advanced genetic technology, a technology like the Crimson Plague. The precursors had not merely marked our ancestors. They had bugged them. The survivors were not spared because they were special. They were spared because they were the alarm system. And the Crimson Plague was not the true attack. It was merely the event that ultimately, after 500,000 years of silence, rang the galactic dinner bell for something far, far older. Chapter 3. The horrifying revelation that humanity was not merely a species, but a genetically tagged alarm system, echoed only within the most secret and fortified bunkers on Earth. The chilling implication that our survival was merely a trigger for a much older conflict was a mystery overshadowed by the immediate, overwhelming threat of the Crimson Plague. But to truly grasp the nature of the adversary who had sprung this ancient trap, to comprehend the cold strategic calculus that viewed our entire species as a resource, we must rewind the clock. We must journey back to the hours immediately following the impossible shattering of 3 Atlas. When the world was still reeling from the revelation that the comet was, in fact, a fleet, we must shift our gaze from the impending biological nightmare on Earth to the direct, brutal physical massacre that was already underway on Mars. Before the plague, before the psionic assault, Mars represented humanity's foothold in the cosmos. It was a symbol of our future, a testament to our ambition. A population of just over 3,000 scientists, engineers, and pioneers inhabited a handful of fledgling colonies. The largest, Ares Prime, was a cluster of semi-subterranean pressurized habitats nestled within the vast plains of Amazonia Planitia. Smaller outposts, such as Olympus Village, clung to the slopes of the Great Volcano, and deep drilling operations searched for water ice and rare minerals in the northern polar regions. They were the most isolated and vulnerable people in human history, connected to their home world only by a thin stream of radio waves. It was these 3,000 souls who had a front-row seat to the opening act of the invasion. They watched through their observatory telescopes as 3 Atlas fragmented, not into chunks of ice and rock, but into a swarm of geometrically perfect hostile craft. For them, the debates on Earth were a distant absurdity. They knew precisely what this was. The attack on Mars was not one of exotic energy beams or reality-bending physics. The alien fleet reserved those tactics for the far greater threat posed by Earth. For the fragile colonies on Mars, they opted for a method of terrifying simplicity and overwhelming force. They employed kinetics from their positions in high Martian orbit. The attacking ships released a series of dense, teardrop-shaped projectiles. These were not missiles with complex guidance systems. They were, in essence, giant metal spears. They were modern-day rods from God. The principle is one of the most basic and brutal in physics. Kinetic energy equals 1/2 the mass times the velocity squared. The alien projectiles, likely composed of an ultra-dense material like tungsten or a manufactured exotic element, possessed immense mass. Dropped from orbit, they were accelerated by Mars's gravitational pull, screaming through the planet's thin atmosphere at hypersonic speeds, reaching a terminal velocity exceeding 5 kilometers per second. The last panic transmission from Commander Eva Rostovar of Ares Prime captures the sheer, hopeless physics of the situation. Her voice, strained with a mixture of awe and terror, was broadcast across the solar system. This is prime station to any listening. The enemy fleet is deploying kinetics. We are tracking multiple inbound objects. Velocity is, dear God, it's Mach 15. They aren't explosive. Repeat, these are not warheads. They don't need to be. The energy yields, we're calculating impact energies in the range of 20 kilotons each. It's like being struck by a god. The impacts were not explosions in the way we understand them. There was no mushroom cloud, no lingering fireball. There was only a silent, blinding flash of pure white light as the projectile, carrying the energy of a small nuclear bomb, struck the rust-red regolith and vaporized instantaneously. The kinetic energy had to dissipate somewhere. It converted into a seismic shock wave of unimaginable violence and a superheated plasma pulse that flash-melted the surrounding landscape. The first rod struck 7 kilometers from Ares Prime. The ground bucked like a stormy sea. Commander Rostovar's final, clipped words were, "Seismic wave inbound. The habitat is compromised. We are losing pressure." Then, silence. The attack was a pattern of systematic, methodical sterilization. One by one, the kinetic rods rained down, striking not just the habitats themselves, but the critical infrastructure that supported them. The solar arrays were shattered into glittering dust. The water ice mining operations at the pole were obliterated, the impacts turning thousands of tons of ancient ice into a flash-evaporated cloud of atmospheric vapor. The nascent atmospheric processes, humanity's first small step toward terraforming, were smashed back into their constituent atoms. The shock waves did what the direct impacts did not. They raced through the planet's thin crust, causing catastrophic cave-ins in the underground sections of the colonies, rupturing the pressurized tunnels and domes miles away from the impact sites. Within the space of an hour, every single human outpost on Mars was annihilated. The most profound and lasting effect of the bombardment, however, was on the Martian landscape itself. The immense energy of the impacts, far exceeding any volcanic eruption the planet had ever witnessed, melted the iron oxide-rich regolith. As the superheated ground rapidly cooled in the thin Martian air, it did not return to red sand and rock. It solidified into vast, circular plains of smooth, black, obsidian-like glass. From orbit, the attack appeared like a disease spreading across the red planet. A series of dark, spreading lesions that consumed the familiar rust-colored desert. They were transforming Mars into a glass desert, systematically erasing the very geological signature of the world that was, and paving it over into something new, something alien. It was an act of planetary resurfacing, of wiping the slate clean with terrifying industrial efficiency. From the panicked perspective of NORAD and the newly formed United Space Force on Earth, this horrifying spectacle conveyed a clear strategic message. First, it was the elimination of a potential fallback position. With Mars gone, humanity was trapped on Earth with no lifeboat and no place to run. Second, it was a profound act of psychological warfare, a demonstration of power so overwhelming that it was designed to break humanity's will to fight before the war for Earth even commenced. Finally, by sterilizing the planet of all terrestrial life and technology, the aliens were securing a forward operating base, a pristine staging ground for their primary assault on Earth. But it was the very last piece of data from Mars, a fragmented, low-bandwidth signal from an automated deep-crust seismic sensor near the polar caps, that hinted at a purpose far stranger than anyone on Earth could have imagined. The automated sensor had survived the initial bombardment, buried kilometers beneath the surface. Its final report, transmitted hours after all human life on Mars had been extinguished, showed that the kinetic strikes had ceased, but the seismic activity had not. The alien ships had landed on the newly formed plains of black glass, and they had begun to drill. The seismic readings were not of impacts, but of massive, rhythmic boring penetrating deep into the Martian crust at multiple coordinated locations. The final automated data packet was appended with a single, chilling analysis tag generated by the sensor's own AI. Activity is consistent not with construction, but with large-scale targeted excavation. They were not merely clearing the surface to build a base. They were digging. They were looking for something that they evidently knew was already there, buried deep beneath the sands of Mars. The final, fragmented data packet from the last automated seismic sensor on Mars painted a picture that was, in its own way, as terrifying as the biological nightmare unfolding on Earth. The aliens were not just sterilizing the planet, they were excavating it. The rhythmic, powerful seismic readings were consistent with a massive, targeted drilling operation, a determined effort to reach something buried deep within the planet's crust. as analysts at a panicked jet propulsion laboratory in the European Space Agency cross-referenced the drilling locations with their high-resolution geological maps, a chilling pattern emerged. The excavation was not random, nor was it targeting mineral deposits. All drilling was converging on a single, infamous region, Cydonia. Mensa. To the public, Cydonia was known for one thing: the so-called face on Mars, a geological formation that, under a specific combination of light and shadow in a low-resolution 1976 photograph, resembled a humanoid face. While science had long since dismissed this as a simple case of pareidolia, a trick of the light, the conspiracy had lingered for decades. Now, it seemed, the conspiracy was not wrong, merely incomplete. The peculiar rock formation was not the primary focus. It served as a marker, a tombstone. And the extraterrestrials from the Three Atlas Coalition, guided by an infallible celestial map, had arrived to excavate this resting place. On Thursday, September 25, 2025, at precisely 9:30 in the morning, Central European Summer Time, the planet Mars was undergoing a profound metamorphosis. Meanwhile, individuals in New York, America, might have been savoring their morning coffee or commencing their workday. The beings from 3I Atlas were unearthing a secret that had slumbered for millennia, inadvertently dismantling the world as we perceived it. Concurrent with this monumental excavation, the alien fleet initiated the second phase of their Martian endeavor. This was not an assault of brute force, but rather a chemical manipulation. A contingent of large, specialized vessels descended from orbit, not to land, but to position themselves deep within the tenuous Martian atmosphere. These were immense, automated atmospheric processors. They commenced absorbing the planet's air, an exceedingly thin mixture composed of 95% carbon dioxide, on an astonishing scale. Initially, terrestrial planetary scientists conjectured this marked the commencement of a terraforming initiative, a disconcertingly rapid effort to render the planet habitable for the interlopers. They were mistaken. This was xenoforming, a deliberate and systematic engineering of an environment inimical to human life. An interview, recorded with the distressed Dr. Alina Petrova, a distinguished astrobiologist, just prior to the global communication blackout, elucidated their strategy. "They are not rendering it breathable," she explained, her voice strained with apprehension. "They are rendering it toxic to a degree we cannot even grasp. Our probes indicate they are employing a form of hyper-efficient cold catalysis to deconstruct the carbon dioxide. They are expelling the carbon as a fine black aerosol, which is already causing the planet's surface to darken dramatically, altering its albedo and elevating surface temperatures. However, the oxygen is not being released. They are bonding it with another element they brought with them, something our spectrometers identify as a hybrid fluorine-sulfur compound. They are manufacturing a new atmosphere of sulfuryl fluoride on a planetary scale. Sulfuryl fluoride is a genuine gas utilized on Earth as a fumigant to eradicate termites. It is colorless, odorless, and lethally effective against oxygen-dependent life. Yet, the gas the aliens were producing was significantly denser and more reactive. It formed a thick, corrosive haze that began to blanket the Martian plains, settling close to the ground like a noxious fog. The consequences were immediate and devastating. The newly formed black glass deserts started to corrode and disintegrate as the gas interacted with the silica. The polar ice caps, a composite of water ice and frozen carbon dioxide, began to sublimate violently, not into breathable air, but into a chemical concoction capable of stripping flesh from bone in mere seconds. Any surviving human technology, such as the venerable Curiosity and Perseverance rovers, would have their metallic exteriors and sensitive instruments corroded into sludge within hours. The aliens were not merely extinguishing a planet. They were salting the Earth, poisoning the well, ensuring that no carbon-based life form from Earth could ever establish a foothold there again. They were altering the very security mechanisms of Mars. It was against this backdrop of interplanetary chemical warfare that the colossal excavation at Cydonia reached its culmination. After days of subterranean drilling, the ground convulsed and fractured. A vast abyss opened, not as a result of an impact, but as if an enormous elevator were ascending from the planet's core. From this chasm, an object of unfathomable scale and design was elevated to the surface. It was neither a city nor a submerged spacecraft. It was a singular, monolithic structure, extending for dozens of kilometers, fashioned from a dark, crystalline material that appeared to absorb all ambient light. Its geometry defied conventional understanding, replete with non-Euclidean angles and forms that seemed to distort vision and cognition. It emanated a deep, resonant energy that was palpable even through the planet's seismic senses on the opposite hemisphere. And it was unequivocally not a creation of the three Atlas aliens. Their vessels, as advanced as they were, seemed like rudimentary industrial implements in comparison to this magnificent, ancient artifact. Its design possessed a more organic, elegant, and an order of magnitude more advanced aesthetic. The analysts at JPL, in their final coordinated report before the global network failed, arrived at a staggering conclusion. The three Atlas aliens had not journeyed to Mars to establish a base. They had come to reclaim their technology, or more accurately, the technology of their progenitors. This buried monolith was unequivocally a piece of precursor technology, originating from the same impossibly ancient civilization that had seeded the human genome. Mars was not a dead world. It had served as a repository, and the Atlas fleet was here to access it. The final act unfolded rapidly. The alien ships encircled the now exposed monolith, connecting to vast energy conduits that became visible along its surface. They began to channel their own power into the ancient mechanism, a process akin to reigniting a dormant deity. For a full hour, the structure absorbed the energy, its internal hum escalating in pitch until it transformed into a silent, planet-wide resonance across all radio frequencies. Then, it activated. From the structure's apex, a brilliant, coherent beam of pure energy erupted, piercing the newly formed toxic atmosphere and extending into space. However, the beam was not directed towards Earth. To the profound bewilderment and terror of the few astronomers still capable of observation, it was aimed outward, away from the sun, a concentrated beam transmission directed towards the void in the direction of the constellation Hercules. It was not a weapon. It was a signal, a beacon, a pronouncement. In the final moments, as Earth's systems began to fail, strategic analysts grasped the horrifying totality of the Martian campaign. The kinetic bombardment was intended to eliminate current inhabitants. The xenoforming was to ensure the planet remained sterile for any future carbon-based life. The excavation was to retrieve and activate the prize. And the prize was a communication device, a galactic all-clear signal to announce that the troublesome, intermittent signal from humanity's alarm system had been dealt with and the package was secure. The last coherent thought transmitted from the JPL analyst before the network went dark was a simple, terrifying sentence. They're not the invaders. They're just the cleanup crew. They had arrived on Mars to awaken a dormant weapon, and now it was signaling that the planet was ready for its true owner. Chapter 4. The transmission from the awakened precursor artifact on Mars is currently traversing the void. An ancient message, finally conveyed after a million years of silence, but its destination is light years away. Its meaning poses a quandary for a future that humanity may no longer possess. Because at this precise moment, 9:36 a.m. on a Thursday morning in late September 2025, the destiny of every single individual on Earth, including those going about their daily lives in places like New York, America, is being determined 1.5 million kilometers away. It is being decided in the cold, unforgiving vacuum of L.1, the gravitationally stable nexus between Earth and the Sun. This is where humanity has drawn its ultimate, desperate demarcation. L.1, or L1, has historically been a site of quiet observation, hosting our most crucial solar observatories and deep space weather satellites. A location where the gravitational forces of the Sun and Earth perfectly balance, allowing an object to maintain a fixed position. Today, it is not a sanctuary of science. It is a battlefield. In the weeks following the shattering of the three Atlas fleet, every spacefaring nation on Earth, in a final, unprecedented act of solidarity, repositioned its covert military assets to this singular strategic point. What humanity managed to assemble represented the zenith of its martial technology, a fleet pieced together from decades of clandestine projects and secret orbital programs. This was not a formation of elegant, crude starships, but a cold, robotic, and stark collection of weapon platforms, remotely commanded from a bunker deep beneath Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado. At its core were the 12 Aegis-class destroyers, immense, unmanned fortresses of armor and weaponry guided by sophisticated combat artificial intelligence. Surrounding them were the Thor-class platforms, essentially colossal railguns engineered to launch tungsten rods at unfathomable velocities. Further back, orbiting a repurposed International Space Station, were the Helios arrays, a series of immense mirrors designed to concentrate gigawatts of laser energy across thousands of kilometers. And weaving amongst them all were swarms of thousands of small, agile drones, designated wolves, conceived to overwhelm an adversary through sheer numbers. This was the entirety of humanity's arsenal, our shield, our sword, and our ultimate hope. From the command bunker, General Marcus Vance of the Unified United States Space Force observed the approaching enemy on his tactical display. The majority of the 3 Atlas fleet, having left a detachment to oversee the enigmatic operations on Mars, had executed a brutally swift trajectory towards Earth. Their vessels, now discernible to the fleet's sensors, presented a nightmarish contrast to humanity's utilitarian gray hardware. They were crystalline, almost organic structures that seemed to glide through the vacuum with no apparent means of propulsion, their multifaceted hulls shimmering with a faint internal luminescence. They resembled living beings more than machines. "They have entered the engagement envelope," a synthesized voice announced within the bunker. General Vance did not hesitate. "Execute Alpha Strike. Fire everything." The human assault was a masterpiece of theoretical space combat, a layered barrage designed to strike the enemy at every range with every available weapon. The initial wave was long-range, a salvo of 100 nuclear-tipped interceptor missiles, their engines flaring brightly against the blackness as they accelerated towards the alien fleet. The second wave, unleashed moments later, comprised the Thor platforms. With a tremendous, silent discharge of electromagnetic energy, they fired their kinetic rods. These were not the planet-crushing ordnance that had struck Mars, but smaller, ship-destroying projectiles. However, the railguns accelerated them to a blistering 1% of the speed of light. The final wave consisted of the lasers. The Helios arrays pivoted, their mirrors focusing the sun's energy and their own internal power into beams of coherent light, painting the lead alien vessels with an intensity capable of vaporizing an aircraft carrier in seconds. The communications chatter from the battle AI was a calm, rapid stream of data. Nuclear volley on trajectory. Kinetic volley on trajectory. Laser arrays are painting primary targets. All systems optimal. Then, the human attack reached its destination, and it failed. It failed so comprehensively, so utterly, that it defied all established models of space combat. The 100 nuclear missiles detonated simultaneously, creating a series of silent, expanding fireballs of pure plasma, a man-made constellation of ephemeral suns. Yet, the alien ships passed through the inferno unscathed. High-fidelity telemetry indicated it was not a shield, as the blast wave of radiation and energy washed over their hulls. The very fabric of space-time around the ships appeared to warp. The energy was shunted, bent around them like a perfect localized gravitational lens, leaving them undisturbed within a calm bubble of normal space. The kinetic rods, humanity's most potent weaponry, fared no better. The hypervelocity projectiles, which should have penetrated any physical armor, were deflected. As they neared the alien vessels, their trajectories were gently but irrevocably curved, as if passing an array of massive, invisible planets. They veered wide, missing their targets by thousands of kilometers, continuing their solitary journey into the void. Finally, the formidable lasers of the Helios array, which had successfully acquired their lock on the lead alien ship, seemed only to augment its power. The crystalline hull of the vessel began to glow more intensely, absorbing the gigawatts of energy, its internal luminescence pulsing with a more rapid, more aggressive rhythm. We were not inflicting damage, we were nourishing them. For a full 2 minutes, the alien fleet simply weathered the onslaught, absorbing or deflecting humanity's ultimate arsenal with no apparent effort. Then, they retaliated, and in that single, contemptuous counterattack, the war was effectively lost. One of the larger, crescent-shaped alien vessels opened a circular aperture in its prow. It was not a gun barrel, but a void in reality, a patch of absolute, perfect blackness. From this aperture, a filament of something that was neither light nor matter unspooled across space. It was a thread of pure void, an impossibly thin line of absolute entropy moving at near light speed. This filament struck the Aegis destroyer Valiant. There was no explosion, no flash of light, no debris. The Valiant, a 500,000-ton war machine of armor and electronics, simply ceased to exist. One moment it was there, and the next, the section of space it occupied was utterly empty. The filament had not destroyed it. It had erased it, unmaking every atom, violating the very principles of mass energy conservation. Another filament lashed out, and another Aegis destroyer, the Triumph, vanished from existence. In the Cheyenne Mountain bunker, a stunned silence descended upon the operators. Only the calm, synthesized voice of the battle AI broke the quiet as it analyzed the telemetry from the destroyer's final milliseconds. Analysis of the void filament's impact is complete. The weapon does not transmit kinetic, thermal, or electromagnetic energy. The target vessel experienced a localized, instantaneous, and total cascade failure of all quantum-level physical laws. All matter within the target area was immediately converted to maximum entropy. The AI paused, then delivered its final, chilling conclusion. Recommended course of action. There is no recommended course of action. There is no defense against this. We are facing an enemy that can turn the universe itself into a weapon. The final synthesized report from the battle AI echoed in the profound silence of the Cheyenne Mountain command bunker. We are facing an enemy that can turn the universe itself into a weapon. For the men and women observing the tactical display, this was not hyperbole, it was a statement of fact. They had witnessed their most powerful weapons, the culmination of a century of technological advancement, rendered utterly impotent. They had watched their destroyers, vessels representing the pinnacle of human engineering, be not destroyed, but deleted from reality. The war for space was not lost in a heroic pitched battle. It was lost in a 10-minute lesson in humility, a brutal demonstration of the gulf between a species that has mastered force and a species that has mastered reality itself. At 9:37 in the morning on a Thursday in America, the sky remains blue. People are still driving to work in New York. The illusion of normalcy holds, but that illusion is a lie, a temporary mirage sustained only by the speed of light. Because 1.5 million kilometers away, the sky has already fallen. The battle is over, and the enemy is approaching. General Vance, confronted with the certainty of total annihilation, made the only decision he could. He issued a single command to the surviving fleet AI, Winter Contingency. It was not an order to fight, but an order to flee. The remaining Aegis platforms and Thor arrays, those not yet erased, executed a desperate, full-power burn, not towards the enemy, but away from Earth, towards the far side of the moon. Their mission was no longer to defend, but to become time capsules, to conceal themselves in the lunar shadows and preserve a record of humanity's final moments. The swarms of wolf drones scattered, becoming a cloud of inert debris, hoping to be mistaken for micrometeoroids. Humanity's presence as a power in its own solar system was extinguished. The 3 Atlas fleet did not pursue. It treated the fleeing remnants of humanity's navy with the same contemptuous indifference it had shown their attack, considering them an insignificant factor warranting no attention. The fleet executed a hard, rapid burn, closing the distance to Earth in a matter of hours. Their arrival was not the slow, menacing descent so often imagined in fiction. It was a brutal, high-speed orbital insertion that filled the sky. From the ground, for the first time, humanity could see its enemy with the naked eye. They were not points of light. As they entered low Earth orbit, they resolved into vast, dark, geometric shapes that blotted out the stars. Their silent passage across the heavens was observed by billions of terrified people. What remained of Earth's conventional military power responded with a final, defiant roar from silos across North America, Russia, and China. Hundreds of intercontinental ballistic missiles, their warheads retargeted for suborbital intercepts, clawed their way into the sky. A new generation of scramjet-powered fighters ascended to the very edge of space, their pilots pushing their machines to the breaking point. It was the planet's last gasp, a volley of fire and steel aimed at the new dark gods in the sky. It was a gesture of utter futility. The same space-time warping defenses that had functioned flawlessly at L1 were even more effective within Earth's gravity well. The ICBMs, screaming towards their targets at Mach 25, found their guidance systems failing, their trajectories bending away as they approached the alien ships. A squadron of advanced fighters launched a volley of hypersonic missiles, only to watch in horror as the projectiles were caught by a localized gravity well, spun around 180 degrees, and flung back at them, annihilating the entire squadron with its own ordnance. The aliens did not fire a single shot in return. They simply moved through our final, desperate attack as a whale moves through a swarm of krill, utterly unconcerned. Then, the landings commenced, and they were not what anyone had anticipated. Small, teardrop-shaped vessels, perfectly black and impossibly fast, detached from the orbiting mother ships. They entered the atmosphere without a sound. There was no sonic boom, no fiery reentry trail. They enveloped themselves in their space-time bubbles, slicing through the air in perfect silence, invisible to radar. They did not target cities. They did not strike Washington, Beijing, or Brussels. They ignored military installations, power grids, and population centers. The first wave of landing craft set down with pinpoint precision in the centers of the world's largest, most remote, and most inhospitable deserts. A lone, terrified journalist, broadcasting on a satellite feed from the Atacama Desert in Chile, captured the initial images. A sleek black vessel, half a kilometer long, rested silently on the arid plains. A ramp lowered, and from its dark interior emerged not soldiers, but something else. They were colossal, multi-limbed machines, part insect, part crustacean, part construction vehicle. These were not warriors, they were laborers. They moved with an unnerving industrial purpose, their bodies unfolding into massive drilling rigs, atmospheric condensers, and strange vibrating pylons that they began to drive deep into the desert floor. Within an hour, identical reports flooded in from the Gobi, the Sahara, the Australian outback, and the Kalahari. The aliens were not invading, they were deploying. The terrifying truth began to dawn on the analysts in the Cheyenne bunker. This was not a war, it was a construction project, and humanity was merely the local wildlife scuttling around the work site. This particular stage of the grand design involved extensive, cold, planetary-scale engineering. The colossal automated constructs situated in the arid expanses commenced their operations. Our presence was entirely disregarded. Their actions were governed by a rationale entirely divorced from human conflicts. Within the Cheyenne bunker, as General Vance and his staff monitored the satellite imagery, they could only endeavor to comprehend the purpose behind this globally coordinated endeavor. The immense spires, erected in each desert, began to energize, emitting a profound, low-frequency, subsonic resonance that transmitted as a palpable vibration through the very bedrock of the continents. Global seismic monitoring stations began to record a novel, rhythmic pulsation originating from each of the landing zones. The extraterrestrial entities were in the process of establishing a unified network, a planetary lattice of synchronized resonant frequencies. The artificial intelligence, by cross-referencing the energy signatures of the spires and their exact geographical coordinates, superimposed a new layer onto the primary tactical display. The landing sites were far from random. Each had been strategically positioned at a critical stress nexus on Earth's major tectonic plates. The spires were not merely broadcasting, they were acting in concert. One after another, they initiated the transmission of a powerful, focused burst of energy, not upwards towards the heavens, but deeply into the planet's crust. This energy release was insufficient to instigate seismic events or volcanic activity, not a weapon in that conventional sense. It was something far more intricate. The AI meticulously analyzed the complex waveform, comparing it against every established model of geophysics and planetary dynamics. A correlation was found. The synthesized voice delivered the day's final, devastating assessment. General, it reported, the resonant frequency of the alien grid. It is a perfect harmonic match for the convective flow of Earth's molten outer core. They're not attempting to fracture the planet. They are establishing a resonant circuit with the geodynamo itself. The AI paused, processing the profound implications. They are seizing direct control of our planet's magnetic field. Chapter 5. The concluding report from the combat AI situated within the Cheyenne Mountain bunker represented a death knell for humanity's standing as a dominant strategic force. With the capacity to weaponize the fundamental principles of the universe, the extraterrestrials, designated 3I, had irrevocably rendered our entire framework of warfare obsolete. Their subsequent appropriation of Earth's geodynamo marked the decisive maneuver in a planetary checkmate. Our planet's magnetic field, the intangible shield that had safeguarded life for eons from the unforgiving radiation of space, was now under their dominion. They commanded the very force that rendered our world habitable. At precisely 9:43 in the morning in New York, America, the sun shines. It feels warm, familiar, life-sustaining. However, this is a deception. The sun has just been transformed into a firearm aimed directly at us, and the aliens' digits rest upon the trigger. They now dictate which portions of our planet will persist in living and which will be rendered sterile by our own star. They showcased this power once, and only once. With an unnerving precision, they diminished the magnetosphere's coverage over a 10,000-kilometer expanse of the remote South Pacific Ocean. Satellites that were not instantaneously incapacitated by the surge of radiation transmitted harrowing data back to Earth. A focused, overwhelming torrent of solar wind and cosmic rays, typically deflected by our protective shield, was permitted to strike the surface unimpeded. The ocean in that particular sector literally began to vaporize. It was a silent, terrifying exhibition of absolute authority. They could now hold every city on Earth captive under the specter of solar immolation, without discharging a single conventional projectile. Humanity was rendered inert, not merely vanquished, but rendered completely and utterly inconsequential as a power. And with our species held prostrate beneath this threat, the true objective of the invasion commenced. It was not territorial acquisition. It was not extermination for its own sake. It was a harvest. From the colossal, city-sized mothership, still maintaining a high geostationary orbit, a fresh wave of vessels descended. These were not the elegantly designed Blacklanders that had deployed the Desert Spires, nor were they the formidable warships that had annihilated our naval forces. These were gargantuan, unwieldy industrial apparatuses. They were tankers, processing units, and mobile manufacturing facilities. Their designs were starkly utilitarian. They bypassed the land entirely, positioning themselves directly above Earth's 5 major oceans. From the underbellies of these hovering giants, vast structures began to descend into the upper atmosphere. The remnants of the media, in their final, faltering broadcasts, referred to them as the ocean siphons. Each siphon was a construct of staggering proportions, a kilometer-wide funnel suspended by its own localized gravitational containment field, connected to the tanker vessel above via a shimmering, translucent conduit that resembled a column of solid crystal. The funnels plunged into the sea, generating maelstrom on the scale of hurricanes. However, they were not merely pumping water. To do so would necessitate an astronomical expenditure of energy to counteract Earth's gravitational pull. The process was significantly more sophisticated and considerably more devastating. As seawater was drawn into the maw of the siphon, it traversed a potent energy field that accomplished instantaneous, in situ desalination. The brine and salt were expelled in colossal, hypersaline plumes that despoiled the adjacent ocean for thousands of square kilometers. The purified fresh water, however, was immediately subjected to a molecular-level electrolysis process. It was fractured into its constituent elements, hydrogen and oxygen. The aliens were not interested in our water itself. They sought the hydrogen contained within it, the most abundant and potent fuel source in the cosmos. The dissociated oxygen was treated as a byproduct, vented directly into the atmosphere, creating localized zones of hyperoxygenation that precipitated terrifying, explosive firestorms within the overlying cloud formations. The ecological devastation was immediate, absolute, and global. The sheer volume of water being displaced and atomized triggered a cascade of catastrophic events. The initial deployment of the siphons in the Pacific, Atlantic, and Indian Oceans generated simultaneous megatsunamis that scoured every coastline on the planet, obliterating coastal metropolises and salinating arable land for hundreds of miles inland. But this was merely the initial violent repercussion. A more insidious and permanent alteration was in progress. The global sea level was receding, not by millimeters annually, as observed with climate change, but by feet per day. Within a week, the port of Rotterdam was reduced to a muddy expanse. The canals of Venice were transformed into desiccated trenches. The Great Barrier Reef became a dying, exposed graveyard. This unprecedented depletion of water fundamentally and irrevocably disrupted the planet's climatic systems. The delicate equilibrium of temperature and salinity that drives the global ocean conveyor belt was shattered. The Gulf Stream, the oceanic current that transports warm waters from the tropics to northern Europe, stalled and ceased to flow within a matter of days. The consequence was a violent, paradoxical climatic upheaval. As Europe began to experience rapid freezing, the Amazon rainforest, deprived of the Atlantic moisture it depended upon, commenced to desiccate. Uncontrolled conflagrations, fueled by the hyperoxygenated air, began to engulf the planet's lungs. Monsoon cycles failed across Asia, leading to immediate, continent-wide famine. The planet's biosphere was being dismantled with the same terrifying efficiency as its military apparatus. The bedrock of all terrestrial life, the marine ecosystem, was the first to be eradicated. The siphons were indiscriminate, atomizing everything from the majestic blue whales to the microscopic plankton responsible for generating half the world's oxygen. The very foundation of the planetary food web was not merely fractured, it was annihilated. In a final, desperate transmission from a deep-sea research vessel, the renowned marine biologist Dr. Eris Thorne, twin brother of the CERN physicist who had first identified the anomaly in London, delivered humanity's elegy. "You must grasp this," he stated, his voice hollow over a crackling radio transmission. "The horror lies in the utter lack of sentiment. They are not boiling the oceans out of cruelty. They are not dispatching the whales out of malice. It is, industrial. It is the action of a farmer clearing a field of its native weeds and insects to prepare for planting a crop. We are not their adversaries. We are an environmental externality to be cleared away for the sake of a more efficient harvest." It was this absence of emotion that constituted the true terror. The aliens were not malevolent. They were occupied. Humanity was perceived not as an opponent, but as an infestation. However, for the last remaining analysts in the Cheyenne bunker, this industrial motive failed to reconcile. The scale of operations was incongruous. By cross-referencing the quantity of hydrogen being extracted with the estimated mass and number of the alien fleet, they arrived at a staggering conclusion. The volume of fuel the aliens were accumulating was an order of magnitude greater than what would be required to transport their fleet to 100 different star systems. It was an energy quantity that was not merely logistical, but planetary in scope. One young analyst, poring over the data, piecing together the Martian excavation, the genetic culling, the seizure of Earth's geodynamo, and now this incomprehensible fuel harvest, perceived the terrifying ultimate equation. Her voice was a mere whisper when she presented her findings to General Vance. "Sir," she reported, "this is not a refueling stop. This is a logistical operation of an entirely different magnitude. They are gathering enough delta V to achieve planetary escape velocity." She paused, her own intellect struggling to process the words. "They're harvesting the fuel necessary to move a planet. They're preparing to relocate Mars." The analyst's whispered declaration in the Cheyenne Mountain bunker, "They're preparing to move Mars," was the single most preposterous and terrifying utterance in human history. Yet, it was the sole conclusion that aligned with the available data. At just before 9:45 in the morning in a quiet German town, a profound realization was solidifying in a bunker halfway across the globe, a realization that redefined the very essence of cosmic dread. It was 9:44 a.m. on September 25th. The sun was shining on New York, and humanity had just grasped that its extinction was merely the incidental consequence of a planetary-scale relocation effort. The ancient precursor monolith, exhumed from its tomb in Cydonia, was not a weapon nor a simple communication device. It was an engine, a planetary propulsion system capable of generating a space-time wake that could displace an entire world from its orbital path. The 3I Atlas fleet was not an invading force awakening a slumbering deity. They were a team of interstellar engineers, poised to activate the ignition. This revelation, however, still left the ultimate question unresolved. Why? Why move a dead planet? Why undertake such an incomprehensible expenditure of energy? The answer emerged not from any human deduction, but from the aliens themselves. At the precise moment the ocean harvesting on Earth reached 75% completion, a 3I Atlas fleet, which we would subsequently come to know by their true designation, finally initiated communication. The broadcast was not a negotiation, a demand, or a threat. It was a formal, dispassionate notice transmitted across every conceivable frequency, from radio waves to microwaves, encoded in a simple, universal mathematical language that the remnants of human scientific knowledge decoded within minutes. It was a legal document, a bill of sale. The document, displayed on the main screen in the bunker under the heading Deed of Transfer, System 458 Sol, was the most horrifying text ever perused. It was a property deed for the fourth planet of our solar system, which it identified as Sol 4. It detailed the transfer of ownership of this asset from a party identified only as the First Gardeners, a name that sent a shiver through every analyst who recalled the precursor theories, to a civilization designated as the Sinian hegemony. The date of the transaction was stamped in a unit of time that translated to approximately 700,000 of our years ago. The price paid for Mars was listed, but it was not in any currency we could comprehend. The entry read, "For the sum of 10 million kilotons of processed exotic matter and the full energy debt absolution of the captured singularity at Cygnus X1." It represented the economics of celestial beings, but it was the addendum to the deed, a small contractual clause at the bottom of the document, that articulated humanity's final, pathetic standing in the cosmos. Clause 7b of the transfer agreement stated, "The indigenous presbysphereing carbon-based fauna of the adjacent asset, Sol 3, are hereby designated as non-sentient biological resources, included in the sale as a source of raw hydrocarbons and hydrogen for the purposes of fueling and activating the sulfur asset. The clearance of said bioresources is the contractual responsibility of the purchasing party." In that moment, the analysts in the bunker understood that the Crimson Plague was not a weapon of war. It was a pest eradication measure, legally sanctioned by a contract signed before our species had even developed the capacity for speech. The ocean siphons were not an act of planetary vandalism. They were the fulfillment of a contractual obligation to refuel an engine. Our entire existence, our history, our art, our love, our wars, all of it was nothing more than a footnote in a cosmic real estate transaction. We were not the subjects of an invasion. We were the fuel for it. We were the weeds in a field that had just been sold to a new proprietor. This legalistic framework revealed the true nature of the Sinian hegemony. They were not the godlike entities who had constructed the Martian engine. They were not the first gardeners who had traded planets like mere playthings. They were a working-class industrial civilization, a blue-collar empire. They were the interstellar equivalent of a planetary moving company, a demolition crew that had been subcontracted to perform a specific task. Their biomechanical forms, which had initially appeared so terrifying, were now understood for what they truly were: perfectly adapted living tools for large-scale, hazardous engineering projects. Their lack of malice, their utter indifference to our resistance, was not a mark of superiority, but the characteristic of laborers on a job site. To argue with them about the morality of our own annihilation would be as futile and as absurd as a colony of ants protesting the construction of a new highway. We were not even speaking the same language of relevance. The true perpetrators of our demise, the ultimate architects of our doom, were the first gardeners, the precursors, the ancient, inscrutable civilization that had regarded an entire solar system as their personal property, had seeded our genome with a genetic tripwire, and had then sold the neighboring planet to an industrial conglomerate, incorporating its entire ecosystem as a negligible rounding error in the final transaction. They were the cosmic landlords who had embedded a clause in our lease permitting the new owners to burn the furniture for firewood. The harvesting of Earth's oceans was nearing completion. Global sea levels had plummeted by over 400 feet, exposing continental shelves and transforming the world's coastlines into vast, barren expanses of mud and salt. The planet's climate had devolved into a chaotic, howling maelstrom of superstorms and flash freezes. The Sinian hegemony, having discharged its contractual obligation to procure the fuel, transmitted its second and final message to the dying world. It was an invoice. The document, which materialized on the bunker screen, bore the title, Invoice for Services Rendered, Bioresource Clearing, Sol 3. It meticulously detailed, in cold numerical terms, the energy expenditure associated with the deployment of the Crimson Plague and the ocean siphons, billing the now non-existent entity of human civilization for this work. It was a final bureaucratic and utterly preposterous insult, the cosmic equivalent of a murderer charging his victim for the cost of the bullet. A junior analyst, staring in disbelief at the invoice, cross-referenced the total energy cost with the data still streaming in from the Mars engine. He perceived the final piece of the puzzle, a truth even more expansive and terrifying than the relocation of a single planet. He turned to General Vance, his face ashen. "Sir," he declared, "the bill of sale, I've reread the fine print. They didn't just purchase Mars. The deed grants them salvage rights to all undeveloped assets within the system. The asteroid belt, the gas giant's moons, Jupiter's hydrogen. They're not just moving a planet." He pointed a trembling finger at the screen. "This isn't a foreclosure on a single property. They bought the entire block. And this," he continued, his voice barely a whisper, "this is just them beginning the demolition." Chapter 6. To fully comprehend the contractual horror of the planetary harvest and the absolute futility of our military defiance, we must rewind the narrative. We must journey back in time, preceding the fall of the heavens, before the advent of the Red Plague, and prior to the first drop of our world's oceans being reclaimed as fuel. We must return to the moment of Genesis, the instant the threat emerged from the chrysalis of a falsehood that had traversed the stars for 1,000,000 years. We must witness the event that transformed a celebrated astronomical curiosity into the harbinger of our extinction, the shattering of Three-Eye Atlas. In the weeks preceding this monumental event, the world was enveloped in a state of scientific elation. The third confirmed interstellar object was nearing its perihelion, its closest approach to the Sun. Every major telescope, both terrestrial and orbital, was trained upon it. By all initial assessments, it appeared to be a comet, albeit an unusual one. Its trajectory was a perfect hyperbola, a clear indicator of its origin beyond our solar system. Its coma, the nebulous cloud of gas and dust sublimating from its surface, was larger than Jupiter. Yet, its nucleus was surprisingly small and dense. But the most eagerly anticipated occurrence was its predicted fragmentation. Based on its trajectory and the immense gravitational and thermal stresses it was about to encounter as it rounded the Sun, astronomers anticipated it would disintegrate. This was not an uncommon prediction. Cometary fragmentation is a prevalent and well-understood phenomenon. The world had watched in 1994 as comet Shoemaker-Levy 9 was rent into more than 20 fragments by Jupiter's colossal gravity, before those fragments slammed into the gas giant in a series of Earth-sized fireballs. More recently, in 2020, Comet C/2019 Y4 Atlas, after which our interstellar visitor was partially named, had fizzled out spectacularly, crumbling into a cloud of dust and ice on its sunward journey. This was what scientific consensus expected from 3I Atlas. Dr. Miles Ingram, the director of the Vera C. Rubin Observatory in Chile, had become the public face of this event. In a globally live-streamed press conference, mere hours before the predicted fragmentation, he elucidated what the world was about to witness. "What we anticipate," he stated, his voice imbued with the calm excitement of a scientist on the precipice of a profound discovery, "is a messy, chaotic, but beautiful disintegration. The tidal forces exerted by the sun will stretch the comet's nucleus like a piece of taffy. Solar radiation will cause the volatile ices on its surface to erupt in jets of gas, further compromising its structural integrity. We will likely observe the nucleus break into a few large segments, which will then further disintegrate into progressively smaller pieces, forming a string of pearls, a trail of debris that will continue along the comet's orbital path. It's a spectacular natural process that affords us a rare opportunity to glimpse the interior of a visitor from another star system." Humanity collectively held its breath. Millions tuned into live feeds from telescopes, expecting to witness a beautiful, chaotic manifestation of cosmic nature. What they observed instead was a silent, precise, and utterly impossible act of intelligent design. At the exact moment predicted by the orbital models, 3I Atlas did not begin to fracture, did not stretch, nor did it fizzle. For a single, silent second, its coma of gas and dust contracted inward, as if the comet had taken a sharp, deliberate breath. Then, it detonated. It was not a fiery chemical explosion. It was a single, incandescent flash of cold, blue-white light, so intense that for a fleeting moment, it was visible as a new star in Earth's daylight sky. The flash was instantaneous and perfectly spherical. When the intensity faded, the solitary core of 3I Atlas was no longer present. In its stead, a formation of ships emerged, not a disordered scatter of celestial debris. A fleet had materialized. Across every planet observatory, computational systems began enumerating the fragments, and the figures they yielded initiated a symphony of dread. The fragments were not of diverse dimensions. They were precisely, mathematically uniform. They were not rough, fractured pieces of rock and ice, but rather sleek, geometric constructs, akin to sharpened arrowheads fashioned from a dark, crystalline substance. And the quantity was not arbitrary. There were not scores or hundreds, but precisely 1,331, 11 cubed. This number was no accident. It was a deliberate declaration of intent, a manifestation of a consciousness that perceived the cosmos through the lens of pure, unadulterated mathematics. Yet, the most chilling moment was yet to unfold. A natural cometary fragmentation would typically result in the debris continuing to disperse, fanning out along its original orbital path. However, the fragments of 3I Atlas did not drift. Mere seconds after the brilliant flash, each of the 1,331 objects ignited a subtle, bluish drive, a propulsion system that emitted no discernible exhaust. With silent, unnerving precision, they began to move. They arrested their forward momentum, executed a synchronized pivot, and commenced arranging themselves into an immense, three-dimensional crystalline battle formation, spanning thousands of kilometers. The spontaneous, chaotic beauty of the natural world had been supplanted by the unyielding, terrifying order of intelligent, hostile design. The entire world observed in a state of stunned, absolute silence. The live broadcast from observatories simply remained fixed on the unfolding spectacle. The presenters and commentators were rendered speechless. Within newsrooms, producers clamored for explanations that no one could provide. In the Cheyenne Mountain Command Center, every monitor blazed with threat alerts. This instant marked a paradigm shift for the entirety of the human race. A singular, collective inhalation from 8 billion people, as they collectively grasped the stark reality. The visitor to our solar system was not an inert celestial body. It was a meticulously crafted Trojan horse, a perfectly camouflaged, expertly engineered weapon system that had leveraged the principles of celestial mechanics to deliver itself to our very doorstep. Dr. Ingram, his countenance pallid, his scientific fascination replaced by an expression of profound existential despair, was still live on air. He leaned into his microphone, and his whispered utterance became the epitaph for the old world. "It's not a comet, it's an egg, and it just hatched." Dr. Ingram's horrified whisper, "It's an egg, and it just hatched," resonated as the defining pronouncement of a new and terrifying epoch for humanity. In the minutes that followed this cataclysmic fragmentation, a profound, shared shock permeated the planet. It was not solely the confirmation of extraterrestrial intelligent life, but the very nature of this revelation that induced paralysis. We had not been discovered. We had been profoundly deceived. The extraterrestrials had not arrived with a terrifying display of overwhelming power. They had infiltrated our domain, masquerading as a celestial spectacle, a cosmic predator cloaked in the guise of a comet. This act of calculated deception, this profound intellectual outmaneuvering, was, in many respects, far more terrifying than the prospect of a direct, brute force invasion. It implied an adversary that viewed us not as equals, but as a species so fundamentally primitive that we could be duped by the most rudimentary of celestial disguises. For a full hour after its formation, the newly formed fleet of 1,331 crystalline vessels remained utterly inert. They maintained their perfect, menacing formation in the void, a silent, static testament to their overwhelming capabilities. This silence constituted its own form of psychological warfare. It permitted the full, crushing weight of the new reality to descend upon the human psyche. There was no ultimatum, no declaration of hostilities. There was only the silent, patient presence of an apex predator that knew its prey was ensnared. This deliberate pause afforded humanity's surviving scientific and military institutions their sole opportunity to scrutinize their executioner at close range. Every available sensor, from the deep space acuity of the James Webb Space Telescope to the classified orbital military arrays, focused intently on the fleet. What they discerned defied the established laws of biology, engineering, and physics. High-resolution spectrometry of the ship's dark, arrowhead-shaped hulls yielded an impossible result. They were not composed of metallic alloys or ceramics. The readings were consistent with an immense, singular silicon-carbon lattice, a form of biomechanical material more akin to the exoskeleton of an insect or the trunk of a petrified tree than the hull of a spacecraft. The horrifying implication was that the ships were not manufactured in a factory, they were grown. The energy readings were even more perplexing. The ships emitted no discernible heat signature. They were impossibly cold, existing in the vacuum at temperatures mere fractions of a degree above absolute zero. This directly contradicted the second law of thermodynamics. Every machine, every living organism, must generate waste heat. The alien fleet produced none. Their energy source was not chemical, nuclear, or antimatter-based. It was something far more esoteric, a process achieving 100% efficiency, perhaps drawing power directly from the quantum vacuum of space-time itself. There were no visible engines, no weapon emplacements, no sensor arrays, no viewports, no seams. The entirety of each vessel's hull presented as a single, unbroken, molecularly perfect surface. The weaponry they would later deploy, the void filaments capable of erasing matter from existence, did not emanate from cannons. They emerged from the very fabric of the hull itself, through a temporary, localized restructuring of the ship's physical form. A frantic, encrypted teleconference between the world's leading scientific minds underscored the depth of our incomprehension. Dr. Sharma, a geneticist from Geneva, contended that the fractal patterns adorning the hulls, unique to each vessel like a fingerprint, were the product of a genetic code. These are creatures, she insisted, engineered life forms on a scale we cannot comprehend. Dr. Thorne, a physicist from CERN, countered with equal conviction. Life cannot violate thermodynamics, he argued. This is a post-technological civilization. They are not living beings. They are perfect machines, quantum computers that have sculpted their physical forms to suit their needs. The grim reality was that both were likely correct. The aliens had effectively obliterated the distinction between biology and technology, evolving into something for which we possessed no nomenclature. After an hour of this terrifying, silent scrutiny, the fleet commenced movement. The maneuver was not an attack, but a stark pronouncement, a demonstration of humanity's utter inadequacy. The entire formation, all 1,331 ships, accelerated simultaneously. There was no gradual ramp-up, no progressive increase in velocity. In one instant, they were stationary. In the next, they were hurtling at 10% of the speed of light. The formation, spanning thousands of kilometers, traversed the inner solar system in mere minutes. It executed a perfectly synchronized, high-speed flyby of Venus, a gravitational slingshot of impossible grace and precision, before returning to its original orbital position near Mars. The entire excursion consumed less than 30 minutes. Within the Cheyenne bunker, analysts and physicists could only gaze in mute horror. The G-forces generated by such instantaneous acceleration should have pulverized the ships into dust, regardless of their composition. It represented a direct violation of the law of inertia. The sole plausible explanation was that the ships were not propelling themselves through space. They were manipulating space-time itself, contracting it before them and expanding it behind. An application of Alcubierre's theoretical warp drive, a concept humanity had yet to even begin mastering. Furthermore, the maneuver was flawless. Not a single vessel deviated in its velocity or position by even a millimeter. This was not a collection of individual ships piloted by discrete entities. It was a single, distributed consciousness, controlled by a singular hive mind. It was a swarm, and every ship was a mandible on the same cosmic beast. Upon their return to their initial position, the swarm executed its first strategic maneuver. With the same fluid, impossible precision, the formation divided. Approximately 1/4 of the fleet, a force exceeding 300 vessels, detached from the main body. This smaller contingent pivoted, their arrowhead-shaped hulls orienting themselves towards the ruddy, dusty sphere of Mars. They held their position, a silent, ominous vanguard whose objective remained entirely enigmatic. The main body of the fleet, now comprising nearly 1,000 warships, turned in unison. Their dark, crystalline forms, which had previously faced the sun, now reoriented themselves towards the third planet, the small, blue-white marble teeming with life. From General Vance's perspective in the bunker, the tactical display, which moments earlier had depicted a single, overwhelming threat, now showed two. One was a formidable fleet poised over Mars, its intentions unknown. The other, the Grand Armada, was now on a direct, high-speed intercept course for Earth. In that moment, he understood this was not a simple invasion. It was a coordinated, two-front war, with two distinct and utterly incomprehensible objectives. His voice was grim as he addressed his command staff. My God, they're splitting their forces. What in hell are they planning for Mars? And what in God's name is about to hit us? Chapter 7. The narrative of the Three Atlas invasion does not truly commence with the terrifying emergence of the fleet, nor with the brutal obliteration of our Navy at Lagrange Point 1. It does not even begin with the initial microscopic agent of the Crimson Plague finding its way into a human lung. The genuine story starts weeks earlier, within the hushed, sterile domes of remote mountaintop observatories and the cluttered basements of amateur astronomers. It begins not with a thunderous roar, but with a series of quiet, unsettling whispers, anomalies that were disregarded, data points that were ignored, truths that were suppressed. This is the account of the first moment the mask began to slip, when a handful of individuals first glimpsed beneath the comet's disguise and perceived the monstrous entity concealed within. In the weeks preceding its perihelion, Three Atlas was the undisputed darling of the astronomical community. Every major observatory dedicated significant observation time to it, primarily employing spectroscopy to meticulously analyze the chemical composition of its expansive coma. Spectroscopy is the scientific discipline dedicated to decoding light. By dissecting the light emitted by a celestial object into its constituent rainbow of colors, scientists can accurately identify the specific chemical elements that are either emitting or absorbing that light. It forms the very bedrock of modern astrophysics. The initial spectrographic readings of the comet's coma were intriguing, yet not alarming. They revealed the predictable signatures of a typical long-period comet, comprising vast quantities of water ice, frozen carbon dioxide, and an unusually high concentration of carbon monoxide, suggesting its formation in a particularly frigid region of its parent star system. It was perceived as a magnificent natural object, a pristine emissary from a distant world. The first anomaly arose quite by accident. Dr. Ellen Petrova, a brilliant but notoriously tenacious astrophysicist at the Keck Observatory in Hawaii, was attempting the seemingly impossible, to obtain a pristine spectrographic reading of the comet's solid nucleus, hidden deep within the blinding glare of its own coma. The project was considered a long shot, but Petrova was utilizing an advanced adaptive optics program designed to filter out the coma's intense light. For an entire week, her efforts yielded nothing but noise. Then, a stroke of cosmic serendipity intervened. A powerful solar flare, classified as an M-class event, erupted from the sun. A wave of high-energy protons and radiation swept across the inner solar system. When this wave impacted Three Atlas, it produced a unique effect. For a few brief minutes, the solar radiation pressure forcefully propelled back the comet's coma. Like a powerful gust of wind parting a heavy curtain, it momentarily exposed the nucleus to a direct, intense surge of solar energy. The nucleus flared brilliantly in the reflected sunlight, and Petrova's instruments captured the event. It was a fleeting burst of data, lasting mere dozens of seconds, but it proved to be sufficient. When her program processed the spectrograph of that momentary reflection, the result was so utterly improbable that the observatory's internal review board immediately flagged it as an instrumentation calibration error. The data indicated the expected faint signatures of water, ice, and silicates on the surface. However, peeking through with undeniable clarity were a series of sharp, distinct absorption lines that had no logical place being there. They were the chemical fingerprints of heavy, refined metals. Not merely the iron and nickel one might expect to find within a P-type asteroid, but tungsten, niobium, and a specific stable isotope of osmium that is not known to occur naturally. It was the definitive chemical signature of a high-temperature manufactured alloy, the kind of material one would anticipate finding at the core of a nuclear reactor or in the armor plating of a warship. Petrova tenaciously defended her data. She conducted every conceivable diagnostic, meticulously recalibrated the entire instrument, yet the result remained unequivocally the same. The nucleus of the comet was, in fact, a metallic sphere thousands of meters in diameter, cloaked in a thin veneer of ice and rock to present the illusion of a natural object. Her conclusion was stark and profoundly terrifying. Thray Atlas was not a comet at all, but an artifact deliberately disguised as one. Nevertheless, her research paper was rejected. The scientific community, steeped in a tradition of conservative skepticism, deemed the conclusion far too fantastical. It was considerably easier to attribute the anomaly to a 1 in a billion instrument malfunction than to a 1 in a trillion alien deception. Her groundbreaking discovery, the first irrefutable proof of the impending invasion, was summarily buried under the weight of peer review. Concurrently, a different kind of whisper was being detected by a distinctly disparate community. Across the globe, amateur radio astronomers, hobbyists, and enthusiasts possessing substantial backyard dishes had also directed their instruments towards the inbound comet. While the professionals were engrossed in analyzing light, the amateurs were diligently listening for radio waves. A small, collaborative group of these enthusiasts, connected through online forums, identified a peculiar signal. It was incredibly faint, buried deep within the chaotic radio noise generated by the comet's plasma tail interacting with the solar wind. By pooling their collective computing power to filter out this natural interference, they successfully isolated a repeating, structured signal. It was not a language, it was not a greeting. It was a complex, repeating burst of pulses, a monotonous stream of data that bore more resemblance to a machine's diagnostic check than a communicative message. It was a steady, rhythmic pulse that users on the forum began to refer to as the heartbeat. It was the unmistakable auditory signature of a vast, intricate machine in a state of low-power hibernation, a silent, slumbering giant. Like Petrova, the amateur collective attempted to bring their findings to the attention of the professional astronomical community. And, much like her, they were dismissed. The natural magnetohydrodynamic effects surrounding a comet could, they were informed, produce a wide array of peculiar radio signals. They were told it was interesting, but ultimately, it was merely noise. However, one of the leading figures in the amateur group, a retired signals intelligence analyst, refused to abandon the investigation. He discovered Petrova's rejected paper on a university server and immediately recognized the profound connection. He contacted her, forwarding her the clean, filtered audio recording of the heartbeat signal. In her office in Hawaii, Petrova painstakingly assembled the two disparate pieces of the puzzle. Her own irrefutable evidence of a manufactured metallic core, coupled with the amateur's undeniable detection of an artificial mechanical signal. The comet was, unequivocally, a machine, and it was undeniably active. Together, they compiled their data into a single, devastating paper and, bypassing traditional academic journals, uploaded it directly to a public preprint server. For a few hours, it was accessible to the world. Then, it vanished. The paper was scrubbed from the server, and every mirror copy was systematically removed. Dr. Petrova received an unsolicited visit from two discreet, unassuming gentlemen from the office of the Director of National Intelligence. The lead amateur analyst was similarly visited by a pair of individuals representing the National Security Agency. They did not employ overt threats, but they clearly conveyed that their research was now classified as a matter of the highest national security, and they were legally bound, by both patriotism and by law, to maintain absolute silence. A small, clandestine circle within the world's intelligence agencies was now privy to the truth. They understood with certainty that the approaching object was not a comet. They knew it was artificial. However, they made a calculated decision. To reveal the truth, they reasoned, would precipitate global panic on an unprecedented scale. It could destabilize the world economy, ignite widespread conflicts, and lead to the collapse of societal order. All of this, for something that might ultimately prove to be merely a harmless ancient probe that would pass by without incident. They opted to suppress the truth. They chose to hope for the most benign outcome. In her office, operating under a strict gag order, Elena Petrova watched the global news feeds, which were filled with celebratory reports of the beautiful, harmless visitor from another star. She knew what lay concealed beneath the ice. She understood it was a machine, and she knew, thanks to the amateur astronomers, that it was broadcasting a heartbeat. She was one of a select few individuals on the planet who possessed the true knowledge of what was imminent, and the only action she was permitted to take was to bear witness. The official suppression of Dr. Petrova's findings and the enforced silence of the amateur astronomers who had detected the heartbeat was not an act born of disbelief. It was an act driven by profound fear. A small, highly compartmentalized sector of the global intelligence apparatus, operating in the shadows of public scientific discourse, had arrived at the same conclusion as Petrova. Frey Atlas was artificial. They knew. But their decision to enforce silence was not motivated by a desire to prevent public panic, but rather by a chilling precedent established 8 years prior. The reason they possessed such absolute certainty regarding the nature of Frey Atlas was because they believed they had encountered its precursor. To comprehend their actions, it is necessary to look back at the first interstellar visitor, the object that inadvertently opened the door for this invasion, a mystery known as oumuamua. This crucial context was explicitly laid bare in a classified memorandum that was leaked during the final, chaotic days from the office of a deputy director at the National Security Agency. The document, bearing the title A Failure of Imagination, the Oumuamua Incident and Event Chimera, reframes the 2017 discovery from a mere scientific curiosity into what is now considered the single greatest intelligence failure in human history. The memo meticulously constructs its case, layering the publicly acknowledged scientific anomalies of oumuamua with classified data that had been deliberately concealed for years. It commences with the official narrative, the superficial explanation of oumuamua. It was, at the time, the first object ever detected traversing our solar system that was definitively confirmed to have originated from another star. It was observed late in its trajectory, already on its outward path, and was only studied for 11 days before it receded to a point where it became too faint to be observed. The mainstream scientific consensus eventually coalesced around the explanation that it was a natural object, possibly a fragment of a nitrogen iceberg dislodged from a distant exoplanet resembling Pluto, or an exceptionally unusual comet composed of solid hydrogen. These explanations were attempts to rationalize its single, most perplexing characteristic, its non-gravitational acceleration. The object was observed to be accelerating as it departed the solar system, propelled by a force that was not attributable to gravity. However, unlike a comet, it exhibited no visible tail, no coma, and no observable outgassing of gas and dust that could account for this propulsion. From this point, the memo meticulously details the numerous inconsistencies and anomalies, the data points that persistently defied the natural explanation. It enumerates them with cold, dispassionate precision. Its shape, inferred from radical fluctuations in its brightness, was extreme. It was not spherical like an asteroid, but possessed a length-to-width ratio of at least 10:1, rendering it either cigar-shaped or, as subsequent analysis suggested, perfectly flat, akin to a pancake or a solar sail. It tumbled erratically through space. Yet, its trajectory remained remarkably stable. Its surface, though dark and ruddy, possessed a shine exceeding that of a typical comet, hinting at a makeup that was more than mere rock and ice. Each of these observed traits, while unusual, could plausibly be attributed to an exceptionally rare natural phenomenon. However, when considered in unison, they painted a portrait of an entity that exhibited behaviors entirely unprecedented in nature. The document then introduces the research of Harvard astrophysicist loeb, a leading voice and staunch advocate for the theory of artificial origin. In a series of papers, met with both controversy and rigorous scientific backing, Loeb posited that oumuamua's characteristics were perfectly aligned with expectations for an extraterrestrial probe equipped with a solar sail. Its flattened form, its lack of atmospheric outgassing, and most significantly, its acceleration, precisely accounted for by the pressure of solar radiation, all strongly suggested a deliberately constructed object. The memo acknowledges that Loeb faced considerable criticism from his peers for this bold conjecture. This segment of the report serves as a prime illustration of the narrative's central tenet, exploring unconventional ideas while grounding them in tangible research and empirical data. Following this, The text unveils a pivotal plot revelation. The NSA dossier discloses information that Loeb could not have possessed. It contains telemetry data from a top-secret surveillance satellite, part of the NRO's Keyhole series, which had been covertly redirected to monitor oumuamua as it traversed Earth's vicinity. This data is presented in a stark, graphical format. As the object made its closest approach to our planet, it executed a minuscule, almost undetectable course alteration. It was not a substantial propulsion event, but rather a precise, minute adjustment. A fractional deviation in its trajectory that was statistically impossible for a naturally tumbling celestial body. It was the unmistakable hallmark of an intelligent system performing a final, subtle maneuver. This single piece of concealed information revolutionized everything. It confirmed the intelligence community's gravest apprehension. Oumuamua was not a random celestial visitor. It was a reconnaissance craft, a probe. It had entered our solar system, surveyed the planets, performed a close flyby of the third planet to study its biosphere and technological emissions, and then activated its propulsion to accelerate on its outward journey, presumably to relay its findings. The scientific discourse that followed was, in retrospect, a charade. The government had already ascertained the truth. The concluding section of the memo directly links this precedent to 3E Atlas. It indicates that the trajectory of 3E Atlas, while not identical, shared a similar high orbital inclination with oumuamua, suggesting an origin within the same general sector of space, near the star Vega. The conclusion was undeniable. Oumuamua served as the scout that conducted the initial reconnaissance and reported back that our system presented a viable target. 3E Atlas, the object that masqueraded as a comet, represented the primary invasion fleet that followed the scout's path. The 8 years that elapsed between these two visitations were precisely the duration required for the intelligence to be transmitted and for the armada to arrive. The memo concludes with a chillingly self-incriminating summary penned by the NSA's own deputy director, serving as a final hook that recontextualizes the entire narrative. The scientific establishment's failure to recognize oumuamua for what it truly was will forever be remembered as humanity's most significant intelligence blunder. We were granted 8 years of warning. We spent that time debating the chemical composition of nitrogen ice formations while the adversary was already en route. The indigenous Hawaiians named oumuamua the messenger from the distant heavens. We now comprehend that the message it carried was a target designation, and the army it summoned is at our very doorstep. Chapter 8. The concealed truths about oumuamua and the quiet, disregarded signals from 3E Atlas at last marked the prelude to our demise. A narrative known only to a select few solemn scientists and anxious intelligence operatives. For the remaining global populace, the 8 billion souls living in blissful unawareness, the end commenced at 0700 Greenwich Mean Time. It began the instant the singular, brilliant flash of the disintegration was observed by every telescope facing daylight across the planet. It commenced the moment the live transmissions from Mars, which were expected to feature a celebratory stream of a close planetary transit, instead began broadcasting a scene of slaughter. This chapter chronicles the events of the subsequent 24 hours. It recounts the day when the abstract, distant peril in the sky transformed into a tangible, immediate, and planet-ending reality. It is the story of the day the heavens themselves descended. The initial casualty was the truth. In the first hour following the genesis of the alien armada, governments and official media organizations worldwide endeavored to control the narrative. They spoke of an unprecedented celestial event. They urged for composure. They pledged further investigations. However, this was an apocalypse unfolding in the information age. Their measured, calming tones were overwhelmed by the raw, irrefutable evidence being streamed directly from the Red Planet. News networks, in a decision that simultaneously informed and terrified the globe, began broadcasting the unedited feeds from ESA and NASA's Mars orbiters. The world watched in real time, in high definition, as the initial kinetic projectiles impacted the surface. They witnessed the blinding flash, the expanding plumes of dust, the silent, brutal obliteration of the Ares prime colony. Social media transformed into a planetary nervous system, transmitting in a state of pure, unadulterated terror. The hashtag Red Planet Massacre trended globally within 10 minutes. TikTok and YouTube were inundated with videos captured by amateur astronomers. Shaky, terrifying footage of the new armada maintaining its impeccable formation. Individuals began posting videos simply gazing upwards, pointing out the new, impossibly luminous star that was the alien fleet, visible even in the daylight. The meticulously constructed edifice of official information, the trusted governments and experts, evaporated within a single morning. The bygone era of top-down information dissemination was over, supplanted by a new reality of decentralized, crowdsourced dread. The second casualty was the global economy. At the opening bell on the New York Stock Exchange, the Dow Jones Industrial Average plummeted by 10,000 points in the initial 90 seconds, triggering every circuit breaker and necessitating a market closure. The same scenario unfolded in London, Tokyo, and Shanghai. The global financial system, a structure predicated entirely on a shared belief in the future, ceased to exist the moment the future itself was irrevocably canceled. Digital currencies became worthless as power grids flickered intermittently. The price of gold became irrelevant when the only commodities of consequence were preserved food, potable water, and ammunition. The very concepts of wealth, savings, and retirement became a bitter jest within the span of an hour. Then came the third and most critical casualty: social order. The collapse was not uniformly instantaneous and violent. It was, initially, a quiet and profoundly personal disintegration. It manifested as millions of individuals calmly rising from their workstations and departing without a word. It was the traffic congestion that stretched for hundreds of miles as people attempted a mass, uncoordinated exodus from urban centers, a futile flight from an adversary that loomed in the skies above every city simultaneously. It was the emptying shelves in every grocery store, stripped bare within hours. It was the long, silent queues outside gun shops. It was the profound, terrifying realization dawning within each individual that the rules that had governed their entire existence, the laws, the social covenants, the simple expectation of a tomorrow, were now rendered null and void. The enemy was in the heavens, but the immediate threat was now present in the countenance of every stranger encountered on the street. While the world was disintegrating from its foundations upward, its leaders remained paralyzed in their subterranean command centers from the top down. Within the White House Situation Room, the Kremlin, and the Politburo Standing Committee in Beijing, the leaders of the world's preeminent powers watched the same transmissions as their citizens, their faces ashen with the same impotent horror. They had been stripped of their authority in a single decisive blow. Their nuclear arsenals were rendered useless. Their armed forces were grounded. Their economies were non-existent. A desperate attempt was made to establish a unified planetary defense council. However, even in the face of absolute annihilation, long-standing suspicions and rivalries resurfaced. The trust essential for a global coordinated response had been eroded over decades and could not be reconstituted in a matter of hours. It was into this vacuum of power, into this moment of peak global paralysis, that the new threat emerged. As General Vance and the remnants of the United States government observed the final of their space-based assets being erased at L1, an incoming message appeared on their screens. It was not from the extraterrestrials. It was a highly encrypted terrestrial signal originating simultaneously from multiple untraceable locations across every continent. The message was decoded within seconds. It was a straightforward text in every major language, stating, "The day of purification is at hand. The harbingers are not your enemy. They are your salvation. The transgressions of this world shall be purged, and the worthy shall be granted a place in the new one. Cease all resistance. Only then can you be judged." The message emanated from an organization unknown to any intelligence agency. However, it was evident they possessed organization, substantial funding, and advanced technological capabilities. The adversary was not solely the silent, terrifying fleet in the sky. The enemy was also present on the ground, a fanatical fifth column of humanity actively welcoming the invasion. The shocking revelation was that this was not merely a conflict. It was a rapture, and a significant segment of humanity was eagerly anticipating the end. The missive from the self-proclaimed children of the Harbinger served as a psychological atom bomb, detonated in the core of humanity's final command centers. It was a startling discovery that fundamentally and irreversibly altered the nature of the conflict. The enemy was not merely an overwhelming external force in the heavens. It was an internal human malady, a fifth column that had been festering in the shadows, awaiting this precise moment to reveal itself. Within the Cheyenne Mountain bunker, the initial reaction was disbelief, followed by a frantic mobilization as intelligence agencies, what remained of them, were tasked with a singular, desperate objective: to unmask this internal adversary. What they uncovered proved more terrifying than any alien armada. Employing their remaining data mining capabilities, NSA and GCHQ analysts discovered that the children of the Harbinger were not a nascent, opportunistic doomsday cult that had sprung up amidst the chaos. They were a deeply entrenched, highly sophisticated, and alarmingly patient global organization. Their digital footprint, once they knew what to search for, was pervasive, woven into the very fabric of society like a venomous thread. This was a conspiracy of staggering scope, and its members were not the fringe radicals one might anticipate. Their ranks were populated by the elite, Nobel laureate scientists, four-star generals, Silicon Valley billionaires, and high-ranking government officials. They were, in essence, the very individuals entrusted with the planet's defense and its future. Intercepted and rapidly deciphered manifestos laid bare the cult's chillingly coherent ideology. They did not worship the aliens as deities in a conventional sense. Instead, they regarded them with a form of dispassionate biological reverence, viewing them as a necessary and natural force. They believed humanity to be a failed experiment, a planetary malignancy whose rampant consumption, warfare, and pollution were about to be surgically excised by a cosmic immune system. The aliens, the harbingers, were not an invading force to be feared, but a purifying conflagration to be embraced. In their view, this was not an invasion but a planetary-scale chemotherapy, and their sacred duty was to restrain the patient while the cure was administered. It represented a perfect, dark synthesis of conspiracy and nihilism, an ancient alien belief system, divested of all its wonder, and replaced by a cold, intellectual yearning for annihilation. Yet, the central enigma persisted. How could such an organization have formed? How could they have anticipated the harbinger's arrival? The answer lay concealed within the very signal that amateur astronomers had initially detected. The faint, rhythmic pulse of 3E Atlas, dismissed by the mainstream as natural radio interference, was far more than the telemetry of a machine. It was a complex, low-bandwidth psionic broadcast transmitted for years as it journeyed through the interstellar void towards our system, and it had been disseminating its doctrine. It was a signal that subtly influenced receptive minds, planting a seed of nihilistic logic that preyed upon those already disillusioned with humanity, the powerful, the intelligent, the arrogant. It fostered a philosophy of inherent failure and an aesthetic appreciation for a grand, cleansing conclusion. The cult was not recruited. It was cultivated, grown from the very seeds of our own despair, nurtured by a whisper from the void. With this horrifying realization, a series of recent, seemingly disparate events were suddenly cast in a new, sinister light. These were not failures or coincidences. They were deliberate, coordinated acts of sabotage, a calculated campaign to ensure humanity would be blind, divided, and weak when the harbingers arrived. Analysts now understood that the reason Dr. Petrover's research into the comet's artificial nature was so effectively and comprehensively suppressed was that two of the most senior members of the Astronomical Peer Review Board were children of the harbinger. They had deliberately buried the single most significant discovery in human history to safeguard their master's deception. The military setback at Lagrange Point 1 was also re-examined. A deep diagnostic of the Battle AI's logs revealed that a critical software update to the targeting systems of the Thor railgun platforms had been inexplicably corrupted mere hours before the engagement. The hypervelocity projectiles, our most potent and indeed our only genuine weapon, had been firing with a microsecond-level timing error sufficient to cause them to miss their intended targets. The error was traced back to a single programmer within the United Space Force, a quiet, brilliant individual who had taken his own life on the morning of the invasion, a final act of a devoted martyr. Even the public's apparent passivity was a manufactured outcome. The coordinated bot networks that had flooded social media with calming, dismissive narratives about the beautiful light show of the approaching comet were found to be funded by a shell corporation owned by a celebrated tech billionaire, a renowned philanthropist who, in reality, was one of the cult's highest-ranking members. Thus, every defense, scientific, military, and societal mechanism had been systematically dismantled from within. The ultimate psychological horror of this revelation descended upon the survivors in the command bunkers. The war was not simply unwinnable. It had been predetermined from the outset. The adversary was not solely the alien at the gate. It was the trusted colleague, the brilliant subordinate, the lifelong friend. Paranoia became the new atmosphere. Every decision was scrutinized, every advisor suspected. In the Cheyenne Mountain Command Center, General Vance was attempting to orchestrate a final, desperate effort to secure nuclear launch facilities with a handful of loyalist units. He turned to issue an order to his chief of staff, a man with whom he had served for 30 years, a man who was the godfather to his children. As his friend turned, the cuff of his uniform sleeve shifted, revealing a small, intricate tattoo on his wrist that Vance had never noticed before. It was a complex geometric pattern of interlocking lines. With a sickening, gut-wrenching certainty, Vance recognized it. It was the same impossible fractal pattern into which the shard in London had dissolved. The cult was not an external entity. It was us. The enemy was in the room. Chapter 9. The Interstellar Projectile. To fully comprehend the horrifying extent of the deception that led to our conclusion, we must undertake one final chronological journey. Prior to the cult's emergence, before the widespread panic, before the moment the sky fell, and even before the first subtle whispers of doubt, there existed a moment of pure, unadulterated scientific marvel. The narrative of our extinction commences, ironically, with what was hailed as one of the 21st century's most significant astronomical discoveries. It begins with the detection of the object that would ultimately be known as 3E Atlas. This chapter recounts the story of that discovery, a sober scientific account of the day we first laid eyes upon our destroyer, mistaking it for a celestial gift. To appreciate the significance of this discovery, one must first grasp the concept of an interstellar object. For the vast majority of human history, every celestial body we observed, planets, asteroids, comets, was an inhabitant of our own solar system, gravitationally bound to our sun. They traverse predictable, closed elliptical paths. An interstellar object, however, is distinct. It is a wanderer, a traveler from another stellar system, moving at such velocity that it passes through our solar system on a one-way trajectory. Its path is not a closed ellipse, but an open curve, a hyperbola. It is, in essence, an interstellar bullet, fired from a distant star millions of years ago, and we possess only a brief interval to observe it as it streaks past. For centuries, such objects remained purely theoretical. Then, in 2017, everything changed. The Pan-STARRS telescope in Hawaii detected a faint, rapidly moving object on an unusual trajectory. It was designated C/2017 U1, unofficially named Oumuamua, the first confirmed interstellar visitor. As we have discussed, Oumuamua was an anomaly that resisted easy explanation, igniting a fierce scientific debate that persists to this day. Then, a mere 2 years later, in 2019, a Crimean amateur astronomer named Gennady Borisov discovered the second visitor, Comet 2I/Borisov. Unlike its predecessor, Borisov presented as and behaved precisely like a conventional comet. It possessed a vast, visible coma and a long, dusty tail. It was a reassuring discovery, serving as proof that normal, natural comets are indeed ejected from their home systems and wander the galaxy. It became the textbook example of an interstellar comet's appearance. These two discoveries established a baseline of scientific expectation. Interstellar visitors could be peculiar, anomalous objects like Oumuamua, or they could be reassuringly ordinary, like Borisov. The discovery of 3E Atlas was a triumph of 21st century technology. It was identified not by human observation, but by the artificial intelligence algorithms of the Vera C. Rubin Observatory in Chile. This next-generation facility is designed to scan the entire visible sky every few nights, a colossal digital eye searching for any movement or change. The AI flagged a faint, rapidly moving object exhibiting an extreme hyperbolic excess velocity, a speed so immense that it could only have originated from the deepest reaches of interstellar space. The astronomical community erupted with excitement. It was only the third such object ever detected, and it was the most remarkable yet. Unlike Oumuamua, which was observed on its outward trajectory, 3E Atlas was sighted during its inbound journey, granting scientists months to prepare for its close approach. Furthermore, unlike the faint, enigmatic Oumuamua, this new visitor behaved like a spectacular rendition of 2I/Borisov. Early observations revealed a massive, brilliant coma, far more active than any comet within our own solar system. It was a perfect specimen, an unblemished fragment of another solar system delivered directly to our doorstep. The naming committee designated it C/2019 Y4 Atlas, the third interstellar object. The name was a nod to the C/2020 Y4 Atlas comet, which had famously disintegrated, and it was chosen with a sense of hopeful irony, reflecting a belief that this new, robust visitor would survive its passage through our system intact. The deception was flawless. The aliens had clearly observed our reactions to the initial two visitors. They understood that Oumuamua's mystery had put us on edge, while Borisov's normalcy had reassured us. Thus, they crafted their cosmic ruse not as an unusual spectacle that would spark concern, but as the most perfect, splendid instance of a natural celestial body imaginable. It was a disguise, intended for admiration, not apprehension, and admired it was. In the weeks that followed its detection, the celestial Visitor 3I Atlas, at long last, became a global sensation. It was a rare instance of accord, a shared sense of universal marvel. Educational institutions hosted evening viewing gatherings. The news outlets broadcast optimistic, uplifting narratives about the potential revelations it held concerning life beyond our planet. It was a beautiful, radiant beacon in the gloom, a symbol of connection to the vast expanse of the cosmos. This period of worldwide rejoicing served as the final calm interlude before the coming upheaval. It represented the last moment of naivety for a species that was gazing directly into the face of its own destruction and perceiving only beauty. From a modest observatory cupola in the upper Takama Desert, a young, gifted astronomer captured the initial high-definition depiction of the comet's core, a breathtaking image of a luminous star-like point enveloped in a magnificent, spiraling emerald haze. She was overcome with a feeling of profound, almost spiritual reverence, the sensation of being the inaugural human to truly perceive this visitor from another realm in such detail. She viewed it as a harbinger of cosmic wonder, a conduit between star systems. She was unaware that the message it carried was a death warrant, and the sole link it facilitated was the passage between our world and the one destined to engulf it. A calculated course, the world's embrace of 3I Atlas's discovery, stemming from its exquisite and deceptively ordinary aspect, resulted in a global phenomenon. Yet, while humanity marveled at the visuals, a small, dedicated cadre of scientists scrutinized the figures within the sterile, hushed server enclosures of the Vera C. Rubin Observatory. The orbital mechanics division was entrusted with the vital task of precisely charting the object's path. Their mission was not to marvel at the comet, but to ascertain its exact trajectory through our solar system. It was within their cold, hard data, encoded in the elegant and unyielding language of mathematics, that the second monumental anomaly, the ultimate disregarded warning, would be uncovered. The initial indication of discord was the trajectory's uncanny accuracy. Interstellar space is not a void. It is a turbulent expanse influenced by gravitational forces. Over the eons, an entity like 3I Atlas would have spent traversing the stars. Its course should have been subtly deflected and perturbed by innumerable star systems, nebulae, and errant planets. Its final approach to our solar system should have been, for want of a better term, irregular, a random vector from the galactic disarray. However, the path of 3I Atlas was not irregular. It was pristine, exact, and disturbingly purposeful. To grasp the improbability of this trajectory, one must first comprehend the principles of gravity. Assists. This maneuver, often referred to as a slingshot, is fundamental to interplanetary exploration for our own unmanned probes. Akin to the Voyager spacecraft, a probe approaches a massive planet, such as Jupiter, utilizing its gravity to alter its course and appropriating a minuscule fraction of the planet's orbital momentum to achieve a significant acceleration. It is a procedure demanding remarkable precision and forethought. A naturally occurring object can, of course, have its trajectory modified by a planet, but the orbital mechanics team discerned that the trajectory of 3I Atlas was not merely being influenced by Jupiter in a random fashion. It represented a flight path meticulously optimized to employ Jupiter for a sophisticated, multi-stage maneuver. The team's simulations, run on some of the world's most potent supercomputers, revealed two impossibilities. Firstly, the trajectory was utilizing a Jupiter gravity assist, not primarily for acceleration, but for deceleration. The object was executing a maneuver known as a gravity brake, shedding just enough of its immense stellar velocity to ensure a prolonged, gradual, and stable passage through the inner solar system. A natural celestial body governed solely by gravity would have passed at its maximum possible speed, affording us only a fleeting observation window. 3I Atlas was deliberately reducing speed to facilitate a more thorough examination. Secondly, and far more damningly, the gravity assist also accomplished a flawless plane change, altering the object's inclination, the tilt of its orbit, to align it on a direct, mathematically precise intercept course with the orbital path of Mars, an event scheduled to occur months later. The lead of the orbital mechanics team, a cautious veteran scientist named Dr. Ben Carter, reran the calculations 100 times. The probability of a random natural object possessing the exact initial velocity and approach angle to execute such a perfect two-part maneuver by chance was not merely astronomical. It was, for all practical purposes, non-existent. It was the celestial equivalent of an arbitrary individual launching a paper airplane from a skyscraper in New York City and having it glide flawlessly through the mail slot of a specific apartment in Tokyo. Dr. Carter and his team presented their findings at an internal observatory symposium, much like Dr. Petrover's spectrographic data prior to this. Their conclusions were met with profound skepticism and outright incredulity. The review panel contended that Carter was committing the cardinal sin of scientific inquiry, anthropomorphism. He was perceiving intent where only physical laws were at play. The universe, they argued, is an immeasurably vast and ancient entity, and given sufficient time and an adequate number of objects, even a 1 in a trillion trajectory is bound to occur eventually. To suggest that the object was under intelligent guidance represented an outlandish leap, a violation of Occam's razor. Carter's report, with its stark assertion that the trajectory was indistinguishable from a deliberately engineered powered flight path, was officially dismissed, categorized as excessively speculative and lacking sufficient evidence to preclude a natural, albeit extraordinarily improbable, origin. The scientific establishment, in its insistence on incontrovertible proof, had rendered itself blind to the terrifying implications of the evidence already at hand. Carter's findings, however, did not pass entirely unnoticed. His rejected report was flagged by an algorithm designed to monitor scientific publications for keywords pertinent to national security. The data was discreetly transferred from the academic sphere to the military. Within the Cheyenne Mountain Command Center, analysts for the United States Space Force processed Carter's orbital data through their own significantly more advanced, classified tracking systems engineered to monitor hostile ballistic missiles, not comets. These systems not only validated Carter's analysis of the Jupiter gravity assist, but also uncovered something he had been unable to detect. The definitive evidence, deep space telemetry, indicated a sequence of minute, almost imperceptible thermal emissions emanating from the object's nucleus at regular intervals. These were tiny course corrections, small engine ignitions, occurring in the vast emptiness between planets, far removed from any gravitational influence. They were not the random, chaotic venting of a comet's jets. They were the precise, calculated, and irrefutable signature of an active propulsion mechanism. The ultimate classified briefing was delivered to General Vance in the deepest level of the bunker months prior to the cataclysm. The presentation culminated with a single, dreadful animated depiction. It illustrated the trajectory of 3I Atlas, not as a passive, natural curve, but as a series of deliberate maneuvers. The initial deceleration burn in deep space, the accurate gravity break at Jupiter, the plane alteration towards Mars, and the small, sustained adjustments of an active guidance system. The general gazed at the depiction of the object's approach, a clean, perfect line that now terminated in a flashing red circle over the planet Earth. He looked at the analyst. So, it's not a projectile, he stated, his voice somber. It's a guided ordnance, and it appears our planet is its final destination. Chapter 10. The Final Transmission. The narrative of humanity's struggle against the entities from 3I Atlas concludes not with a blaze of heroic defiance, but in the stifling silence of a subterranean sanctuary deep beneath a mountain in Colorado. The harvest of Earth is complete. The oceans have been reduced to shallow saline pools. The atmosphere is a chaotic, fractured ruin. The overwhelming majority of the human population has been transformed into the living crystalline framework of an alien industrial enterprise. On the surface, the progeny of the Harbinger serve as overseers, managing the few remaining enclaves of unaltered survivors. Their unwavering faith has been rewarded with the position of custodians in a planetary necropolis. Within the Cheyenne Mountain Command Center, the last redoubt of the old world is on the verge of collapse. The ultimate conflict is not against an extraterrestrial adversary, but a human one. General Vance and the dwindling contingent of soldiers loyal to him are in a tense standoff with adherents of a cult who have revealed themselves within The command structure. The war for the planet has been lost for weeks. This is the final, desperate skirmish for a bunker. It is a confrontation born of the ultimate betrayal, the last convulsion of a species vanquished both from without and from within. At this precise moment, as the opposing factions are poised to engage, the Sinian hegemony transmits its final message. This is not a broadcast of written words or spoken sounds. It is a direct psionic data stream employing the same technology that had for years cultivated the cult, but amplified 1,000-fold. The message bypasses conventional senses and is directly implanted into the consciousness of every remaining human mind on the planet. It is a message incapable of being ignored or misunderstood. For the survivors in their desolate encampments, for the cultists standing guard, for the soldiers and traitors within the bunker, the world dissolves. There is no sound, no light. There is only a sudden, absolute immersion in an alien psyche. For a duration of 60 seconds, every last human being perceives the universe through the perspective of the Sinian hegemony. They experience an influx of memories, emotions, and data spanning billions of years. It is an instant of perfect, terrifying empathy, a brief, compulsory enlightenment. The confrontation in the bunker freezes, weapons half raised, as both Vance and his former comrades gaze into the same shared internal abyss, their personal dispute rendered utterly inconsequential. This is the pivotal revelation that recontextualizes everything. The message is an admission. The initial visuals depict the Sinian homelands, gas giants orbited by magnificent floating cities of living crystal, circling a brilliant blue star. They showcase a civilization of inconceivable age and sagacity, a people who had long ago transcended strife and deprivation. They were not combatants. They were cultivators, artists, and thinkers. Then the images shift. A shadow emerges at the periphery of their home system. It is not a fleet of vessels. It is a wave of pure non-existence, a fractal, consuming emptiness that propagates between the stars, a pocket of mobile, weaponized entropy that unravels the very fabric of space-time as it advances. The message displays dozens of their worlds, hundreds of billions of their people being not annihilated, but eradicated, unmade by this silent, unyielding adversary. This is the authentic nature of the dark forest. The fundamental terror of the universe is not that other civilizations are hostile rivals. It is that there exist predators of such magnitude that they hunt entire galaxies for amusement or sustenance. The Sinian hegemony are not the predators. They are the last refugees. For millennia, they have been in flight, escaping across the galaxy, witnessing their ancient empire being devoured world by world. Their entire civilization has been reduced to this convoy of nomadic biomechanical vessels. They are not invaders. They are the desperate, traumatized survivors of a far greater and more horrific conflict. Their grand, desperate strategy is revealed. They possessed an ancient legend, a narrative of the primeval gardeners, a mythical race who had sown the seeds of life across the galaxy and had constructed cosmic weaponry of unimaginable potency. The hegemony's flight was not random. They were adhering to an ancient map, seeking a rumored, forgotten armory. That armory was our solar system. The precursor engine on Mars represented their final hope, the only known weapon capable of combating the shadow. Our system was selected for its resources. The harvesting of our oceans was not an act of subjugation. It was the desperate collection of propellant for the ancient weapon. The Crimson Plague was not an act of malevolence. It was the swiftest, most efficacious method for neutralizing the local fauna that was hindering the rearmament process. Our extinction was a tragic, but in their estimation, essential logistical prerequisite for their own continued existence. The psionic deluge of information ceases. The connection is severed. The survivors across the planet are left gasping, their minds reeling from a truth that is both an absolution and a condemnation. Within the Cheyenne bunker, the enchantment is broken. General Vance lowers his weapon. He surveys the command center, his former adversary, the cultist, and perceives not a traitor, but a simpleton, a man whose entire fanatical belief system has been shattered. The cultists revered the harbingers as a divine purifying force, only to discover in the most intimate manner possible that their deities were as terrified and desperate as the rest of humanity. The final element of the message, the one indelibly imprinted upon every human mind, is a single, clear depiction. It is a tactical chart of our local sector of the Milky Way. On one side, a symbol represents the Mars engine, now fully energized. On the other side, at the edge of the Oort cloud, is the adversary. It is a vast, silent, and impossibly enormous fractal wave of pure entropy, the same entity as the void filament that had annihilated our fleet, but on the scale of a nebula. It is a wound in reality itself, and it is moving inexorably towards our solar system. The conflict we had waged was a meaningless skirmish. The true war, the one for the survival of this entire quadrant of the galaxy, was about to commence. Vance gazes at the primary screen, which displays the completed harvest and the ominous, rising energy signature of the Mars engine. He speaks, not to any specific individual, but to the vacant, silent chamber. All of this, our entire world, he states, his voice quiet and heavy, looking up at the stars and pondering our solitude. It was merely them preparing the arsenal for the true apocalypse. This is the concluding hook, a promise of a significantly grander narrative to unfold. Echoes in the dark. The 60-second psionic broadcast from the Sinian hegemony marked the final chapter in the war for Earth. A message that concluded not with a threat, but with a shared dread. The connection was severed, and the survivors, both within the bunkers and on the ravaged surface, were plunged back into the deafening stillness of their broken world. The new, terrifying knowledge of the true enemy, the immense consuming shadow in the void, did not bring peace, but it did confer a profound and horrifying lucidity. It was a synthesis that returned the listeners to a new, far starker reality. Within the Cheyenne Mountain bunker, the standoff between General Vance's loyalists and the children of the Harbinger dissolved. There were no surrenders, no arrests. The ideological gulf between them had become irrelevant. The cultists, who had revered the aliens as a divine force of purification, were now confronted with the reality that their gods were merely frightened refugees engaged in an act of desperate, monstrous self-preservation. Vance's soldiers, who had viewed the aliens as an implacable, malevolent force, now understood them as a tragic, cornered civilization. They were neither enemies, nor allies, nor masters. They were all simply a prelude to a much grander horror. In the quiet aftermath, the two factions began to collaborate, their prior animosity replaced by a shared, unifying objective to comprehend and to endure what was imminent. This was the new paradigm. Humanity was no longer a dominant entity, but a handful of survivors residing on a depleted, dying planet that had inexplicably found itself on the vanguard of a cosmic conflict beyond our comprehension. This revised mission acknowledged the immense uncertainties while preserving the inherent drama of the situation. They re-examined all the occurrences of the preceding months through this new, terrifying lens. The scout probe, the camouflaged fleet, the genetic blight, the planetary harvesting. Every action undertaken by the hegemony was reinterpreted not as an act of conquest, but as a step in a desperate logistical endeavor to arm themselves. Their actions had been monstrously cruel, yes, but it was the cruelty of a terrified animal, severing its own limb to escape a snare. This allowed for a sliver of something that was not precisely forgiveness, but a grim comprehension. The true culprits remained the original gardeners, the precursors, the silent architects who had orchestrated this entire cosmic tragedy, leaving behind a superweapon on one planet and a genetically tagged fuel source on another. Were they the agents who had initially attracted the great predator? Were they the source of the very blight the hegemony was fleeing? These were the new, unanswerable questions that plagued the survivors. And yet, in the face of this absolute existential despair, a fragile new hope began to emerge. It was not the hope of victory, or even of survival in its conventional sense. It was the hope of bearing witness. The survivors, a coalition of the remaining military personnel and the cult's former scientists, initiated a new undertaking within the ruins of the bunker, christened Echo. Its objective was not to confront the shadow. They understood the futility of such an effort. Instead, it was to assimilate all possible knowledge about it from the hegemony's final data transmission, and to preserve that understanding, they commenced work on a deep space probe, a final message in a bottle from a dying species designed to document everything that was about to transpire and utilizing a shielded faster-than-light drive based on the hegemony's own principles to launch itself into the intergalactic void, a warning to other galaxies regarding the darkness that consumed ours. They meticulously re-examined the enigmatic genetic sequence that had rendered them immune to the Crimson Plague. It was the precursor's alert mechanism, but perhaps it also held a deeper significance. Was there a corresponding component of precursor technology concealed on Earth, a sanctuary or a repository that this genetic key was intended to access? The pursuit of this hypothetical precursor cache became the second and most pressing objective of the Echo Project. It represented a faint glimmer of hope that respected the grim scientific realities of their predicament. Months elapsed. From Earth, the survivors observed the heavens. The Sinian hegemony entirely disregarded them. Their task here was complete. The colossal ocean siphons retracted into their tanks and ascended, rejoining the main fleet. On Mars, the gargantuan precursor engine, now fully fueled by the hydrogen accumulated over 1 billion years of Earth's existence, was activated. The red planet, the subject of so many of humanity's aspirations for expansion, began to emanate a fierce internal glow. Then, with a silent, majestic grace that defied all known physical laws, it began to move. It was no longer a planet. It was a warship, a mobile fortress world, positioning itself between the approaching darkness and the sun. The survivors on Earth were now relegated to the role of mere spectators. They were the mice left in the walls of a dwelling about to be obliterated in a conflict between gods and monsters. In the concluding scene, General Vance records a message, the inaugural entry in the Echo Project's archive, a final testament for a future that would likely never materialize. This serves as the concluding hook for any subsequent narrative. We spend our entire history, he states, his voice quiet and burdened, gazing upwards at the stars and wondering if we were alone. The answer we have discovered is both yes and no. We are not solitary in the universe, but in the face of the vast, silent, and insatiable darkness that separates the galaxies, every one of us, human, Sinian, and whatever else might exist out there, is filled with terror and utterly on our own. The dark forest is not a realm where you conceal yourself from your neighbors. It is a domain where everyone collectively hides from the darkness.